So we're going to start today with two of our invited talks, and it gives me huge pleasure to introduce George Lowenstein, who's going to talk to us about 3 decades, can you believe it, of research on the information gap. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to take the prerogative of being certainly the oldest person in the room to give a bit of a discursive talk. It's not going to be as coherent as the talks you've been hearing so far. I just put together a bunch of slides. 3 decades. In 1994, I published a review paper on curiosity, and I did a bunch of experiments on empathy gaps in curiosity, showing that people couldn't predict the force of curiosity on their own behavior. And I sent it into JPSB, and it got rejected with 3 negative reviews. And they all said, this guy doesn't know anything about curiosity. So I decided to write a review to look into the literature. I didn't. The critics were actually kind of correct. And so I did a review of curiosity with a plan of going back and publishing the original paper after I'd kind of established my credentials, but I never did go back to publish the original paper. But I did publish this paper in which I proposed, among other things, a information gap account of curiosity. So I viewed curiosity as arising when attention becomes focused on a gap in one's knowledge. The curious individual is motivated to obtain the missing information to reduce or eliminate a feeling of deprivation. At the time, this is kind of early in the days of behavioral economics, and I was very influenced by prospect theory, and I'm sure that prospect theory kind of helped give me this idea. And I kind of modeled curiosity with a prospect theory value function. And the idea, if you have a gap, if this is your reference point and this is what you actually know, and the reference point value function makes 2 strong predictions. One is that marginal curiosity is going to become very intense as you become close to closing the gap, because this line becomes very steep. And loss aversion implies that you're going to be very motivated to close the gap. And you might be way more motivated than it actually turns out that you get pleasure from getting the information. So that I talked about curiosity, the satisfaction of curiosity being disappointing in general. So I enumerated some of curiosity's most salient features in that paper. Its intensity, even though curiosity by definition is just a desire for information for its own sake, and its stimulus dependence and its transience. Russell Goldman, my colleague from whom I got this slide template, Russell has done some really nice work on the transience of curiosity. And as I said before, the disappointment when curiosity is satisfied. Is the psychiatrist, Riza, are you in the audience here? No. Anyway, I was talking to a psychiatrist yesterday who's really into Freud. And Freud believed that curiosity was derivative of the sex drive, which I think is kind of a crazy idea. But if you look at curiosity, it is striking how many features it does share with the sex drive. Certainly its intensity, its stimulus dependence and transience. You can decide whether or not you think the third one applies. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about some follow-up ideas and research. A bit of background. Recently, I've gotten very interested in attention, and with a former graduate student, Zach Wojtowicz, we published a review on attention in the Journal of Economic Literature, and it's kind of attention for economists, and a paper in Cognition, a study in mental economy. And in the paper, we talk about how psychologists distinguish between bottom-up, kind of involuntary, and top-down, voluntary mechanisms that direct attention. And we argue, one of the new points we make in the review is we argue that there should be a third category, and this is attention-directing motivational states. and this would include curiosity, boredom, and flow. And these are kind of a hybrid of bottom-up and top-down processes. These motivational states are like bottom-up processes. They're involuntary. They're not deliberate. But like top-down processes, they operate by biasing deliberate decisions about where to direct attention. So if you're curious, then you're driven to get information, and you're biased in favor of getting information. If you're bored, I actually think that, to me, curiosity is specific, what Berline called specific curiosity, and to me, exploration isn't curiosity at all. To me, exploration is much more a function of boredom and shouldn't be connected to curiosity. Why did these kind of attention-directing motivational states exist? Why did they evolve? We argue that they evolved to allocate mental resources without drawing upon them. So they're automatic, and so they don't use the scarce mental resources, attention, but they bias attention. So a bunch of talks from yesterday touched on information avoidance, and I think curiosity is on a kind of a continuum with information avoidance. By the way, I think that boredom is on a continuum with flow. Curiosity is on a continuum with information avoidance, although I think the mechanisms are different. Curiosity, I think, is an evolved kind of visceral mechanism, whereas information avoidance tends to be more kind of a cognitive decision that people make to avoid the decision, to avoid information. There's a lot of research in economics on information avoidance. Emily Oster, who's actually an economics professor here, she did some work on how people with Huntington's disease, who are at risk for Huntington's disease, don't get tested. Isle and Rao showed that when you give people a little bit of information about how other people might rate their appearance or about their intelligence, if it's below what they expect, then they don't want to get any more information. I've done a lot of research looking at investor attention, and in a 2016 paper, my co-authors and I find that investors are less likely to log in when the market is down on the previous day, the previous week, or the previous month, and these are all intercorrelated with one another. What about people who have bond portfolios? If you have a portfolio that's 100% bonds, is it good news or bad news when the stock market goes up? Bad news, that's right. And people who have bond portfolios look at exactly the opposite times as people with stock portfolios. When the stock market goes down, the people with the stock portfolios don't look, and the people with the bond portfolios all look. It's a very strong effect. Men, older people, more educated people, and those with a higher fraction of stocks, and amazingly, those who are richer, those people who have larger portfolios, they're all more ostrich. Russell, David Hagman, another former graduate student, and I wrote another Journal of Economic Literature review on information avoidance, and again with Nachum Sickerman, with whom I did the investment research. We've been looking at parents of autistic children and information avoidance. Very often what we find is the parents are the last to know that their child has autism, and we did a survey with parents and family and friends of children who were diagnosed with autism, and both the parents and the family and friends agree that the family and friends realized that there was something going on before the parents did. By the way, we also find that having a maternal grandmother in the house leads to diagnosis 6 months earlier. I think maternal grandmothers tend to be very blunt. That's my experience. We've also, we being an overlapping group, David Hagman again, Emily Ho, and I developed a scale to measure information preferences. Yesterday I was talking to somebody about what are fundamental preferences. Like I think in economics we have this concept of time preference. I don't think that time preference is a fundamental preference. I don't think that some people are more impatient, some people are less impatient, but I do think that information preferences are fairly fundamental. There are people who really don't like to hear bad news, and there are people who they always want to know what's going on. And so we developed a scale to measure this, and the scale includes 3 subscales: consumer finance, personal characteristics, and health. Here's an example from consumer finance. 10 years ago, you had the opportunity to invest in 2 retirement funds, Fund A and Fund B. For the past 10 years, you've invested all your retirement savings in Fund A. Do you want to know the balance you would have if you had invested in Fund B instead? And here's an example from personal characteristics. You gave a toast at your best friend's wedding. Your best friend says you did a good job, but you aren't sure if he or she meant it. Later, you overhear people discussing the toasts. Do you want to know what people really thought of your toast? And finally, health. You provide some genetic material to a testing service to learn more about your ancestors. You're then told that the same test can, at no additional cost, tell you whether you have an elevated risk of developing Alzheimer's. Do you want to know whether you have a high risk of developing Alzheimer's? Anyway, when we were developing the scale, a friend of mine and I, we were doing a road trip, and we both took the scale. I came out at the absolute extreme of information avoiding, and he came out at the absolute extreme of information seeking. And there are just huge individual differences on this measure. And we validated it in studies that predict various types of information seeking or avoidance in situations that have consequential outcomes. Curiosity and information avoidance are often pitted against one another. I remember when I was for too long, I was a horrendously bad teacher, and the teaching ratings would arrive in a big envelope, and I would always put them on the shelf. I had a huge pile of them. When I finally decided that maybe I did an okay job, that was the first time that I read my teaching evaluations. But I was always really curious. I was always kind of torn between not looking and looking. And curiosity and information avoidance are often pitted against one another. And an important domain in which they are pitted against one another is health information. People often avoid health information that could be useful for them to obtain. Think about Huntington's disease. It would be very valuable to know if you have Huntington's disease. It might inform your decisions about career, whether to have children, things like that. But a lot of people don't get tested. And we study whether it's possible to use curiosity to overcome information avoidance. And this paper has 5 different studies. In each study, the curiosity induction increased the fraction of people opting to obtain the information. And in study 5, it actually affected their choice of soft drink. Study 1, maybe I'll just show you 2 of these studies. Study 1 has to do with alcohol use. I'm kind of proud of this study. Alcohol is consumed in most countries around the world, yet culture and customs play an important role in how and how much people drink. You may be surprised to find out that your drinking habits are more similar to someone in another country than someone in the US. Based on the answers you give to questions in the survey, we'll be able to identify what nationality your drinking habits are most like, ! We'll tell you if you drink more like someone in France, Italy, Germany, England, Russia, or the US. And then we ask them a bunch of questions about how much they drink. And this is this is the curiosity treatment. And then in the control condition, we don't do this thing about what we ask them the questions, but we don't tell them stuff about that. We're going to tell them which country they are, which citizen they're like, a drinker like. And in the control condition, 55% of people want to see how dangerous their drinking is for their health. In the curiosity condition, 77% do. There's another study where we had people guess, or we blurred out the information. Those are both curiosity inductions, and this is about colon cancer risk and we got a significant difference. And then I'll show you the last study. We asked people which of 4 beverages they like most to drink: Coke, Pepsi, Snapple, lemon tea, or vitamin water. They all sound kind of grotesque to me, but they were told that they get a chance to receive 6 bottles of either a regular or a sugar-free version of the beverage that they said they liked the most from that list. And they were randomly assigned to 2 conditions. In the information condition, they were just told what percentage of the daily recommended sugar was in 1 bottle of the regular, that is not the sugar-free beverage. In the curiosity condition, they were first asked to guess it, and then they were given the answer. That's the only difference between the conditions. And then they indicated whether they'd like to receive their preferred drink either in the regular or the sugar-free version. And as you'd expect, given that I'm showing you the results, if we look at people with no restrictions, people who actually like soda, people who where their preferred drink was one of the 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, all of them showed the curiosity had a significant impact on their likelihood of choosing a diet drink. In another set of papers and another line of research, we've been arguing that a lot of what is called information avoidance isn't information avoidance, it's actually attention avoidance. People aren't trying to get information, they're trying not to think about stuff. And I'm just going to show you, we have done kind of rigorous research on this, but I'm just going to show you a kind of what I think is a kind of a funny example of it. For a while I was doing some consulting for this South African health insurer called Vitality, and I was at a board meeting, and one of the executives was showing off the front page of their app, and you can see that it shows the Vitality age, which is basically your health age. Now, would you prefer to have a health age that's older or younger than your chronological age? Younger. Yeah, that's right. And I asked the woman who was presenting, I asked her, well, on average, are people's age older or younger? And she said, older. And I said, well, that's strange. Nobody's going to want to get onto your app, like if they see that their health age is older than their actual age. And she said, oh, we've got that covered. We've got this hide button. And so if you click on hide, your Vitality age disappears. And so I said, oh, that's interesting. Will you send me the data? So this is like a huge number of people. This is the health age as a function of chronological age. And this just reinforces what she told me, that most people's health age is older than their chronological age. But the interesting thing is the data on who hides. And you can guess what I'm about to show you. And the older your health age is relative to your actual age, the more likely you are to hide the information. Why is this interesting? Well, I think it's a good illustration of attention avoidance rather than information avoidance, but because by the time you hide it, you already know the information, right? So you're not avoiding the information, you just don't want to have your nose rubbed in the information. And I think that's true for a whole lot of situations where we think people are avoiding information, they're actually avoiding attention. So back to information gaps. Russell and I have written a bunch of papers about information gaps. He's way more mathy than I am, and he helped me to come up with he came up with a theory, like a formal theory of information gaps. And the question has to do, this question was asked a bunch of times yesterday. There's a lot of things we don't know that don't bother us, but we do have feelings about specific uncertainties that capture our attention, and this is what I was referring to as information gaps. A lot of beliefs have valence. They can feel good. It can feel good or feel bad to think about those beliefs. In general, people prefer to have less uncertainty, but how much the uncertainty or the beliefs themselves affect your utility, like your kind of moment-to-moment well-being, depends on how much attention you pay to those beliefs. And so we came up with this theory of information gaps, a theory of preferences regarding the presence and absence of information. So economists model information with partitions of state space, which I've always found incredibly unintuitive. I think this is a much more intuitive way of representing people's knowledge. So people have a bunch of questions that could or could not be activated. The questions have possible answers. The answers have possible subjective probabilities. And most important, each of these questions has some weight, attention weight, applied to it. So if you have a weight of 1, you're paying full attention. If you have a weight of 0, you're not paying any attention. In this framework, there are also kind of objective prizes, like outcomes that people can experience. I'm not going to go through this equation, but basically it says that people care about outcomes, they dislike uncertainty, and they like thinking about things that make them feel good. And it generates predictions about a lot of things, like, for example, decision-making under risk and ambiguity. It's often pleasant or unpleasant to think about uncertain things. You don't know what's going to happen, or ambiguous things. You don't know what the probability is of different things happening. Anyway, we published a paper applying this to kind of decision-making under risk and ambiguity. But what I'm going to focus on is, how many minutes do I have? 5? Okay. In the next 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about the application of this theory to information seeking and avoidance. Some testable predictions about information seeking and avoidance from this framework. So obtaining information has 3 effects. It can help you to make better decisions. It reduces uncertainty, and it focuses your attention on anticipated beliefs. And attention to, all of our papers, we argue that attention to a question is increasing in importance. How much is at stake, which depends on the possible answers, on salience, how much the context highlights the question, and on surprise, how much your beliefs have to change to accommodate the new information. Here's a study that actually didn't make it into our paper, but I think it's kind of cute. It manipulates the feeling of getting closer to or further away from information. This was done with 162 CMU graduates, and they watched short animations about famous CMU graduates. And there were 2 conditions, forward and reverse. In the forward condition, you felt like you were getting closer to the information. You can almost taste it. It's like the tip of the tongue phenomenon. In the reverse situation, you're getting further from the information. And then we looked at the amount of time they devoted to revealing the identity of the CMU graduate versus skipping to the next item. Here's the forward condition. You can see you're getting closer and closer to seeing a clear picture of the person. Here's the reverse condition. You're getting further from getting the information. It always stops in the same place, though. And anyone can guess who this is? Yeah, that's right. By the way, we claim him as a graduate, but I think he only spent like a half a year at Carnegie Mellon. And as you would expect, when people feel like they're getting closer, they are more curious and they watch more of these animations. A bunch of studies, we gave people these types of, what are these problems called, Russell? Rebus puzzles. 2 for practice. Anyway, we give them 5 puzzles, 2 for practice, 3 for $2. They get a bonus if they're all correct. And we tell them how many they got correct. And we elicit curiosity to get the correct answer to this last puzzle. And we exclude subjects who got it correct. And the way we elicit how curious they are is they have to click a bunch of times. I think another study yesterday had the same intervention. And up to 9 times and then they finally get the answer. The answer, by the way, is moral support. We manipulated importance by creating a situation where either when they did the last puzzle, they were on track to get paid, or they weren't on track. They'd already made a mistake, so they weren't on track to get paid, and importance made them more curious. We manipulated salience by either giving them the information immediately or only asking them if they wanted to see the information a day later, and that made them more curious. We designed this facial recognition test where you try to figure out what emotion somebody's experiencing just by looking at their eyes, and then we elicit their curiosity, their willingness to complete an optional, boring 3-minute task to find out how they did on the facial recognition test. And we manipulated importance. Again, that worked. I'll show you this one. We gave some people really difficult ones, and we gave some people really easy ones. But we always told them how they did relative to everybody. So the people with the difficult ones, it looked like they did really badly. The people with the easy ones, it looked like they did really well relative to other people. And then we said, do you want to find out what your score, which of these two scores is yours, their actual score or a score that was 20 points plus or minus what they got. So they didn't, we showed them two scores and they didn't know which one it was, but let's say it could have been 20 and 40, or it could have been 70 and 90. And so, of course, and so we're manipulating valence. Are people more curious to find out which of these two good scores they got or which of these two bad scores they got? And as you'd expect, they are much more interested in finding out which of the two good scores they got. Summary, curiosity is one of several motivational states that evolved to direct attention efficiently. Curiosity is on a continuum with information avoidance. Curiosity can be used to overcome information avoidance. A lot of information avoidance is actually attention avoidance. An information gap perspective can be used to generate a wide range of testable predictions. That's it.
Hey, thank you so much. We have time for some questions.
Hey, I was just wondering, you talked about a few kind of manipulations to make people more curious, but is there something to kind of do the opposite? I work a lot on chronic pain, and people are almost sort of too curious and kind of going from treatment to treatment, and I was wondering if there is a kind of an opposite way that way.
Well, I don't know if the issue is curiosity, but the issue is I just wrote a book, and one of the chapters is about the downside of hope. And I think I remember when I severed a nerve in my back, and I went from doctor to doctor trying to get the answer. And finally, I went to a doctor who said, "There's nothing you can do about it. Just live with it." And it was such a relief. And I think that there's a huge downside of hope. And hope and curiosity are probably interconnected.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question regarding the first part of your talk, where you stated that curiosity lies on a continuum with information aversion, whereas boredom lies more on a continuum with flow. If I interpret this correctly, this would assume that both features, or boredom and curiosity, at least they are orthogonal to each other. So what would be your idea? Can both states coexist in an individual? So can a person be bored and curious at the same time, or is this mutually exclusive?
Well, I think that boredom and flow can't exist with one another, because boredom is designed to get you to change your focus of attention. Flow is designed to motivate you to maintain it. But I think that, in fact, the boredom flow continuum and the curiosity information avoidance continuum are orthogonal to one another. And you can certainly be bored and curious. right. You can, and you could be curious and in a state of flow, I'm sure. I'm sure that's very common. So I don't think that they are, I don't think that they are mutually exclusive at all.
Thanks.
Hi, just a little comment. I mean, I really like your framework, and I wanted to just push it a little further. Attention, so I want to introduce the concept of cognitive effort, which I think is very closely related to attention. So it could be that in a lot of the cases, even medical news avoidance, that's a signal that your whole life needs to change, your whole assumptions need to change. You need to engage in a lot of learning, right, in order to deal with this new reality. That's effortful. So, you know, we are thinking based on neural data of attention as a form of effort, cognitive effort. And the second point that I wanted to make is not just attention avoidance, but probably learning avoidance, right, which is even more effortful. So.
Yeah. When I first put these slides together, I actually had effort, cognitive effort on that slide. I think it's a little bit different from the others. I mean, cognitive effort is like a really interesting riddle. Like most of what happens in the brain is not associated with a feeling of effort. There's just a few types of mental operations that are. Why are those particular ones associated with effort and not others, like, for example, vision, which occupies a huge part of the brain? And of course, we evolved the feeling of cognitive effort for good reasons. And I think, I kind of think that cognitive effort might have more to do with working memory than with attention. But that's my that's my personal. Okay, yeah. But I think. Yeah. I think there's a paper by Angela Duckworth and colleagues on effort in brain and behavioral sciences. And they argue, in that paper, they argue actually that effort and boredom are the same. And I absolutely don't agree with that at all. But yeah, I think cognitive effort is like a really interesting riddle.
We'll take two questions in a second. Ali Reza, could I ask you to try sharing your screen, please, just so we can sort out any issues if not? And can I ask, is Elizabeth here who's giving a talk in the second part of this session? Elizabeth? No. Okay, so we have a little bit more time. So I'll take a question here and then over there.
Great. Thanks for an interesting talk. You gave a lot of great examples of people choosing to avoid negative information. I was wondering how morbid curiosity would fit into your framework in these continuums that you've described, because that's sort of a counterexample, right, where people are actually really curious about something that's negative, potentially even something that is really aversive. Like, for example, some people like true crime, but it also makes them really afraid or might make them, uncomfortable in their daily life.
Yeah. St. Thomas Aquinas, in one of his writings, he writes about Alypius, and whose friends brought him to a Colosseum for a gladiator show. Like, so somebody's like fighting with a lion, and he doesn't want to see it, he closes his eyes, and then the crowd roars, and he can't resist, and he opens his eyes and he sees the gruesome scene, and then he really regrets it. And I think that's really a good illustration of how visceral curiosity is. And I think morbid curiosity is like, that's a perfect illustration of morbid curiosity. And it's a nice illustration of how curiosity and information avoidance are often pitted against one another.
Thanks for the talk. I had a question about one of the first slides that you presented, which said that curiosity is sometimes followed by disappointment. And I'm trying to understand that, because my initial interpretation was that, oh, you're disappointed because you got your question answered. You seeked information to end the curiosity. But on thinking further, I'm also thinking that curiosity could lead you to an answer, which could then lead you to a whole bunch of new questions that you could be potentially curious about. So then in that case, would you think the disappointment is coming from the fact that, you're overwhelmed by so much you don't know and you want to seek more answers? Or you wouldn't quantify that as disappointment then.
Right. I'm certainly not saying that the resolution or satisfaction of curiosity is always disappointing, and often the information can lead to all sorts of good things, like it could lead to a whole new research project, for example. But really what I'm saying is the loss aversion is accentuating the power of the motivational power of curiosity. But then when it's satisfied, you're just at the 0 point, and that's kind of inherently not very satisfying. I think there are a bunch of things that are like this, where you're so driven to get things because, as a result of loss aversion, you're pursuing some kind of a reference point that's above where you are. But then when you actually achieve it, you're just experiencing kind of nothing. You've closed the gap, and that's just not inherently very satisfying. But absolutely satisfying curiosity in many cases can result in all sorts of satisfactions and good outcomes. Thank you.
Great, so let's thank George again for persisting with the research and for a great talk. Okay, so next up we have our second invited talk from Ali Reza, who's joining us on Zoom. So do you want to just say hello, Ali Reza, and we can check we can hear you, and then I'll hand it over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's perfect, thank you. Take it away when you're ready.
Perfect. Do you also see my cursor and my video?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. First, before starting my talk, I really would like to thank the organizer to begin with, inviting me despite all the uncertainty around the fact that whether I can get the visa or not. And then for their support and understanding afterwards when it turns out that I cannot attend the conference to make this possible, that I give this talk online. Thanks a lot. And now about the science part, I'm going to talk about surprise and novelty in human reinforcement learning. And by that, I mean I want to really limit my talk about a very particular setup that we assume there are extrinsic goods out there in the world, nutrition, money, intimacy, and etc. And people would like to go around and take this to these extrinsic goods. This can be throughout about the decision making on a daily basis or over the course of a lifetime. And how people make this kind of decision has been the main topic in neuroscience, cognitive sciences, and psychology. And there has been so many work showing that there are different functional modules that involve in this decision making, from exploration to planning and adaptation. And there has been so many work showing that psychological construct of surprise and novelty play critical roles in these different functional modules. Specifically, there has been many different terms related to surprise and novelty, ranging from prediction error to uncertainty, information gain, information gap, Shannon information that has been used by many researchers to describe different aspects of, for example, learning in the brain. A very famous finding is that when you're surprised, you learn faster. There has been a lot of work also connecting these notions to exploration, that, for example, when you're more uncertain about an environment, you start searching to decrease this uncertainty. There has been a lot of work on memory, saying that we remember novel stuff more vividly in the future. And of course, there has been a lot of work on physiological signals related to these terms. I don't know, when you're surprised, every neuron on your brain goes on fire, and so many things changes. And if I naively look at this picture, it appears that surprise is everywhere in the brain and is involved in many, many different mechanisms. And as soon as I put this meme on top of my slide, one natural question emerges, that whether surprise, in the statement that surprise modulates synaptic plasticity, is the same as surprise in the statement that surprise drives curiosity. That has been the topic of our work for the last couple of years. We tried to put different definitions of surprise and novelty together and analyze them from different aspects. Our short answer is no. Different people in the field mean different things when they use terms surprise, uncertainty, and novelty. The long and more complex answer is that we can look at these definitions, both the verbal ones and mathematical ones, try to look at these exact mathematical definitions, connect them with each other, and then come up with a categorization and a taxonomy that provide a more refined terminology that then we can take this categorization and refined terminology and more systematically study what aspects of surprise and novelty contribute to learning, memory, exploration, and different physiological signal. We have been studying these different links over the past years, and today I would like to focus on 3 subcategories of this taxonomy and discuss what we found so far about their link to exploration. Basically, I would like to ask what drives human exploration in complex environments. So how do we study this? This is a typical experimental paradigm that I'm going to rely on throughout my talk. We always had in-lab experiments, so people came to the experimental lab, sat in front of the computer. On the computer, they saw like one image. At each time is a state. Here is a coffee cup. After a bit, 4 actions appear below the state, these 4 gray disks. They could use their mouse and click on one of these actions, and after clicking on the action, they would see another image. And they were instructed to do this action selection until they found the goal state, and then they would get this thumbs up. They would get a few Swiss francs. The experiment was done in Switzerland. Unknown to the people, these transitions were governed by underlying graph that we see on the right. Each node in this underlying graph corresponds to one of the states. For example, the G is the goal state, is a thumbs up, and every arrow corresponds to one of the transitions. For example, when on the left side, the participants took the right action at the coffee cup and ended up in the light bulb, this is equivalent of participants going from state 1 through this arrow to state 8. So what is special about this environment that we have here? We have 11 states, one of them being the goal state. 7 of the others we call progressing states. So in each of these progressing states here, one action let participants stay where they are. One action is the progressing action that take the participant closer to the goal state, so they can get closer to the purpose of the experiment. And 2 out of 4 actions are the bad actions that takes participants to what we call trap states. When they are in the trap states, 3 out of 4 actions keep them in the traps, and only 1 action per state takes them out. So basically, to do these experiments, to be able to navigate and get to the goal state, participants need to learn what is the good progressing action in each state and what are the bad actions to avoid the bad action and take the progressing action and go to the goal state. A critical point is that the assignment of these different arrows to different buttons on the left side, this was random in the beginning of the experiment, was kept fixed throughout the experiment. So basically, by doing that, participants could not generalize from state 2, for example, to state 3, that what is the good action. So it's a very, very complex task. And we asked 12 participants to play this game for 5 episodes, basically meaning that finding the goal state for 5 times. The most exciting part for us and most relevant for this conference was episode 1, which is the exploration phase. Just imagine that participants are initializing a state 2. They don't know anything about this environment. They don't know how the states are connected. The only thing they know is that they can take these actions and move from one state to another. They have to navigate and explore until they found the goal state. We can prove mathematically that if you take randomly each action with 25% probability, it takes you on average 10,000 actions to find the goal state. Imagine every action taking 1 second, that would be 10,000 seconds. This is impossible to be done. Incredibly, actually, these 12 participants found the goal state on average in 100 actions. This is 2 orders of magnitude faster than the random exploration. And as soon as they found the goal state, in the next episode, they were randomly initialized somewhere else. They took basically the direct path to the goal state. It's just incredible. So they were super fast in finding the goal state, and then they had this one-shot learning that afterwards they could just go back to the goal state. So we ask, how do participants explore this environment? It cannot be random because they are orders of magnitude faster than random. A viable alternative is directed exploration. So what do I mean by directed exploration? If model every participant with a reinforcement learning algorithm that takes as input a state, gives out an action, and this action is passed to this environment that is our graph, and the graph gives back another state. So this participants that is now modeled by a reinforcement learning algorithm function based on two reward function. One is the extrinsic reward, which basically is whether they saw the goal state or not, and they would like to maximize it, and this becomes relevant from episode 2 onwards, where they know where the goal is. And throughout episode 1 mainly, the behavior is directed towards maximizing some sort of intrinsic reward that counts as exploration bonus. For example, the first version that we consider is state novelty. What does that mean? Let's say that the participants is exploring this environment. In the beginning is a bit random. They end up a lot of time in the trap states. They have seen the images of the trap state many times. Probably these images haven't been state 4, 5, 6, haven't been seen that often. And because of that reason, they are assigned a higher novelty. So if someone wants to maximize the novelty reward, would prefer to go to this part of the environment. A second alternative would be transition surprise. So it's not only about how familiar or unfamiliar this particular image is, but it's about how expected this image is given the previous action, state and action pair. In a deterministic environment like this basically means that how uncertain I am about every action, in a sense that how many times so far I have taken it. And an exploration strategy that is directed based on the transition surprise basically would like to try all the actions, because it is in principle possible that if there is an action that you haven't tried yet, that actions can take you to the goal state. So these two basically corresponds to two different classes of exploration strategies. One is state-based, the other one is transition-based. And of course, we consider the control that is no intrinsic reward. If you're familiar with it, is a traditional idea of optimistic initialization. Basically, it directs based on extrinsic reward. If I go back to this framework that I try to say that we have this taxonomy of different definitions, because this environment is deterministic, all definitions of all agreed upon definitions of surprise shrink out to something that says that how uncertain a particular action is or not. So basically, with this experiment, we want to test whether participants follow surprise and transition uncertainty for their exploration or novelty. For that, we do an exhaustive model selection. Here on the y-axis, you see probability of a model being generator of the data, given data. And on the x-axis, you see 13 different models. What is the take-home message of this figure is that all the models marked in red are those with novelty-seeking with the novelty-seeking modules. And those are the ones that have basically non-zero probability. So the main message of this model selection is novelty-seeking explain participants' exploration better than surprise-seeking or optimistic initialization. If I take this model, that is the best model here, and test it on human behavior, we get a cross-validated accuracy rate of 60 to 70%. And just imagine that we don't know anything about these participants. In the beginning, everything is equally likely, so the chance level is 25%. And getting to 60 to 70% for this exploration part, it means that the model is super accurate. So what I want to argue is that the novelty seeking is not only a relatively good model of behavior, but also in an absolute sense, it's a very accurately predictive model. So for the first part of the talk, I would like to argue that novelty drives human exploration in multi-step reward-seeking tasks where people have to search for a goal state. When we published this paper in 2021, and I went around and I started presenting it, every time this question was raised that aren't these results trivial? Because basically we have an experimental paradigm where we have these bad trap states. People have to avoid these trap states, so maybe it's just good to follow novelty. And that brought a puzzle for us, that do these results hold even if novelty seeking is suboptimal? So we said that let's make novelty seeking suboptimal. For that, we took inspiration from the machine learning literature. This type of intrinsically motivated RL algorithm have been used in machine learning literature for so long, since 90s or even 80s. in different fields from robotic to deep reinforcement learning. But a very well-known problem of these models is what is called noisy TV problem. That if you make an algorithm interested in surprise, and then if you put a noisy TV on the wall, that algorithm would be interested in this noisy TV because it can never predict the next one, so it's just everything is surprising. And if this TV just show random images or videos, just like TikTok, so the algorithm would be excited to just keep looking at that. So we said, let's add a noisy TV to our experimental paradigm. We consider an environment very similar to before. Is a bit simpler because now instead of 3 trap states, we have 2 trap states, and instead of 4 action per state, we have 3 action per state. And then we took this environment and added a noisy TV part to it. So in this new environment, instead of a self-looping action in state 4, we have a stochastic action. When people take this stochastic action, they are taken with uniform probability to one of these 50 different states randomly. So each of these states have an image of their own. And when they are in this stochastic part of the environment, they have again 3 actions. One action, which is the same across all 50, take them out to state 4. So they cannot get lost here. Even if they randomly select action with 1/3 probability, they can get out of the stochastic part. And this is important information. But the other 2 actions are again stochastic, and when people take them, it takes them with uniform probability to another of these stochastic parts. In total, we have 58 states, 2 reaction pair states, and importantly, this total number of states is unknown to both human participants and oral agents. So again, the task is very complex. We put this environment that we had and tested different intrinsically motivated reinforcement learning algorithm in it to check if we can see this suboptimality, this noisy TV problem. The first thing that we can check is prediction surprise. If we make this algorithm interested in unpredictability of transition, it just goes to the stochastic parts, enjoys it very much, gets stuck there. But then we could confirm what has been known in the machine learning literature, that there is a hierarchy of intrinsic rewards. Particularly, the best intrinsic reward to deal with this kind of stochasticity is what's known as information gain, or also is related to progress rate. That, for example, if the agent experiences this transition, how much they learn from this particular transition. And if someone is exploring this stochastic part for a while, after a while you realize that, okay, everything is uniform, I'm not gaining any information anymore, and you naturally avoid it. So this is just the best way to realize that there's nothing more to get out of the stochastic part, and the agent naturally go out of it and go back to the goal state. And in between, we have the novelty seeking. So by adding this stochastic part, this heterogeneous stochasticity, we can now suddenly talk about more than just novelty versus surprise, but we can dissociate different types of transition surprise, and we can see this hierarchy of different intrinsic rewards. So the new environment allows us to dissociate between different intrinsic rewards, and now we have a situation where novelty seeking is not optimal. How do humans explore the environment? We asked 57 participants to play this game for 5 episodes, basically finding the goal state for 5 times. But to further motivate exploration, we told participants that there were 3 goal states. So if they would see the photo of the 10 euro bill, they would get 2 Swiss francs. If they would see the photo of a 50 euro bill, they would get 3 Swiss francs, 100 euro bill, 4 Swiss francs. However, there was only 1 goal state in the environment corresponding to this location G. So for 21 participants, this goal state was 2 Swiss francs, for 19 was 3 Swiss francs, for 17 was 4 Swiss francs. By doing that, we somehow manipulate the incentive to explore from episode 2 onward. So at the end of episode 1, the 2 Swiss franc group already found these goal states. They are reinitialized in state 1 and 2, and now they have to decide whether they want to go back to the 2 Swiss franc goal or they want to explore. And because it is possible to find a better goal state, they have this reward optimism. But exact opposite is true for people who already found the best rewarding state, so there's no monetary incentive to go around and explore. How do people behave? Let's first look at the most optimistic group of people. The most here on the x-axis, we see different episodes, so episode 2, 3, 4, 5. And on the y, we see the median number of actions taken before going back to the goal state. The important point here is that they show a persistent exploration. This value, the number of actions they take before going back to the goal state, that doesn't go down. While it is possible theoretically, if you are following something like information gain, to go back to the goals, to decrease this acceleration over time. This average number of actions is, of course, a decreasing function of this exploration incentive. So the less incentive, the lower time you spend exploring. And also the lower proportion of this time, now on the y-axis, you see the fraction of time spent in the stochastic part. The lower fraction of your time you spend in the stochastic parts. But the critical thing here is that even the group with the least incentive to explore still spend a non-negligible amount of time in the stochastic part of the environment. And this is not because they could not learn the task. Afterwards, I can show you the evidence that they could reconstruct the graph of this environment. So the take-home message of this behavioral part is that participants use a directed exploration strategy because they get attracted to these stochastic parts, but their strategy is theoretically suboptimal in the sense that they did not go down over time, and they did not realize that there's nothing else in the stochastic part. We can do proper model selection, look at different intrinsic rewards. What we see that is that, again, probability of model given data, novelty seeking explain the behavior better than information gain seeking, surprise seeking, or no intrinsic reward. And if we look at this novelty seeking and simulate it, we can replicate the key qualitative features of the behavior. So altogether, I try to argue that novelty drives human exploration in multi-step reward seeking task. And this is true even in the presence of heterogeneous stochasticity, where novelty seeking is not optimal. So if I get back to this big picture of human reinforcement learning and all these decision-making parts, what I tried to do today was to replace this general verbal definitions with more precise mathematical definitions, design experimental paradigms that can directly test these, systematically test these mathematical definitions and their influence on particular exploration, and show in one instance, two instances, that novelty seems to be the drive of human-directed exploration in our task. It is possible to do the similar thing with many different functional module of human decision-making, talk about curiosity, that whether this novelty seeking that we see in this particular type of task is also relevant for the curiosity as a general, less reward-driven behavior or not. But we can also go beyond this surprise and novelty-related psychological construct and talk about other construct and try to mathematically characterize it. For example, recently I started working on sense of control, efficacy, and controllability. And particularly that becomes very important, again, for exploration, because one can think about exploration as a way to decrease uncertainty or to maximize control. Yeah, and that's a general picture I want to advocate for, and I would like to thank my collaborators that made this work possible and you for your attention. Thank you. I hope I'm on time.
Thank you so much. That was great. And yeah, perfect timing. So we have some time for questions.
Hi, Alireza, that was a great talk. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear.
Great. So the one thing that I wanted a little more clarification on was that you said that in the second environment, the novelty-seeking behavior that you saw was suboptimal. And what I wondered is whether you meant for the actual graph or for the instructed graph, because the instructions implied that there were a couple other rewards out there, and I wondered whether it's true that if you modeled the graph with those extra rewards, that you would still be at a disadvantage using this strategy?
That's a very good point. So I'm going to first answer the mathematical part. All our models are aware of the existence of these other rewarding states with higher reward values. So the novelty-seeking module, the novelty-seeking algorithm is aware that there are these 3 rewarding states out there, and because the model hasn't seen them, they have very high novelty value. It has it in mind. And despite this assumption, still novelty-seeking is not the optimal exploration strategy. Did I give the... because I cannot see your face. I cannot infer whether I convinced you or not.
Yeah. So when you say we're aware, like I guess what I had in mind was like you could simulate with actually having these in the environment and see what the performance level of that model would be compared to other models. I think I'm not exactly what you mean by when you say was aware that these states were in the environment. Like, was it like through a set of simulation experiments, or
yes?
Okay, cool. All right, then yes, I I got it. Thank you.
Hi, Ali Reza. Can you see me?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
To the same observation, so that late persistent exploration of people in the second task, I wonder if you, could that, so you said that people understood that those states are not getting you to the goal, those extra surprise states, right? But I wonder if you, or understood the model, the model of the task, but I wonder if you considered possible uncertainty over that predictions or their confidence, because maybe they just weren't sure. Did you have that?
That's true. That's true. So in principle, I'm going to answer a question that I understood. If I didn't understand it correctly, please correct me. In principle, even the best algorithm, which is like the information gain seeking, if you corrupt its memory, it's going to keep exploring this part of the environment.
Exactly.
So So if you include uncertainty, even information gain seeking can be suboptimal. But by even including those information in the model, still it appears that novelty seeking explains the human behavior better. But you are right that the fact that they keep exploring this part of the environment can have multiple different reasons. But we believe that one of these reasons is still that people direct their exploration towards a novel part of the environment. Of course, the uncertainty also and forgetful memory is also a part of this reason.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, thanks for a really great talk. A very interesting task. Just to check, the state transitions are deterministic, right? In this task,
except
or
for
probabilistic?
Except for the stochastic part of the environment.
Okay, right. Do you think that surprise would be relatively more important for understanding behavior in a task where the transitions are all probabilistic and you might see more of like a prediction error effect? You
mean all stochastic, so homogeneously stochastic or heterogeneously?
No, heterogeneously, yeah. So like if you were able to develop a stronger expectation that, say, state 1 will lead to state 2, and in some cases that's violated, and maybe occasionally it brings you to a trap state, but sometimes it's good. Like if there was more utility then in sort of responding to violations of expectations, do you think that you would see more of a contribution of surprise in the models, whereas with the ones that you did with these mostly like deterministic state transitions, you're seeing that it's really explained by novelty as opposed to surprise?
I agree with your point, the first part, but I thought that actually we did that in our experiment because we have 58 states and 50 out of 58 are stochastic.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much again, Ali Reza.
Thank you.
Let's thank Ali Reza again. So we're going to hand over to Jordan, who's going to tell us about curiosity in the moral domain. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Just make sure this is, okay. Great, thank you all so much, and thank you to the organizers. I'm really excited to share some of this work with you all, and hopefully talk some more about it during the coffee break. So people are often curious about other people, curious about what they're doing, what they're thinking, why they're doing it, why I'm interested in this subject, et cetera, et cetera. And so now I want you to imagine you have the opportunity to learn about two people, one person who helped somebody who fell down, and another person who maybe pushed somebody as they were sort of walking by on the street. Which one do you think you'd like to learn about? I won't ask you to say it or share it out loud, but keep it in mind. So when we look to the literature in moral psychology, there's a great deal of evidence that suggests that people would avoid the person who pushed the other person. People avoid those with morally bad features, condemn people who morally transgress, readily assign blame to bad others. We're incredibly adept at noticing moral badness and avoiding it. And so based on this, we might expect that people would want to avoid that person who pushed someone because they're bad. But as we saw some yesterday in some of the earlier talks, what people want to approach versus avoid is more complicated than that. And there are many examples of people being drawn to immoral themes and content, especially in fiction. I think this interest is really clearly reflected in the kinds of TV characters, for example, that people are really drawn to. So this is Walter White, if you're not familiar. He is a drug kingpin, Wednesday Addams, Joe Goldberg from the show You, who is a stalker murderer. These are among some of the most infamous and popular characters ever conjured. And it also, it isn't just in television. One of the most, or said to be one of the most interesting characters ever created is Satan from Paradise Lost. And so by and large, it seems like people really enjoy spending time thinking about immoral agents. And so based on this, we might predict that people are actually fascinated by immorality and those who commit it. And so that's what I set out to explore. I first looked at this in the context of TV, as I've sort of alluded to. And I looked at TV because people spend a whole lot of time watching TV. People spend about 3.2 hours a day just streaming Netflix, and that's about 6 billion collective hours a month. So this is a massive time commitment. And so I looked at public data on hours of programming for the top 10 Netflix shows and movies over a 5-month period. I scraped the US ones for that window, and then I had, a set of prolific participants go through that list for the ones that they were familiar with and rate the morality of the protagonists of that show. And this is excluding kids' shows, but through this process I learned that children watch a lot of CoComelon, a lot of CoComelon. So here I have moral character of the protagonist on the x-axis and then the total number of hours watched on the y-axis. And so what we find is this small but statistically significant negative trend. People tend to spend more time watching immoral protagonists on Netflix than morally good ones, an effect which gets stronger when we adjust for all the things that we could and thought of, things like genre, total runtime of an episode, things like that. And interestingly, with our discussion earlier, this same relationship emerges when we look at cognitive effort. So people also will say that the shows that feature immoral protagonists are more difficult to watch. They're more taxing, and nonetheless, they're the ones that people seem to care more about. So next we looked at whether similar patterns emerge when we look inside the lab. And I adapted a decision-making paradigm that's been used in some prior work to get at immorality, this interest in immorality in the lab. And so we asked people to choose to learn about a novel, immoral, or morally ambiguous or morally good agent. And this guiding question is, do people choose to learn about novel, immoral, and ambiguous agents more so than good ones? And so I taught people about these two decks of cards. They could choose between them. Both offer some kind of social information. The first deck we called the Describe deck, and the second one we called the Learn deck. And we asked people to select between them on a series of trials. If they selected the Describe deck, they were taught that it would reveal a picture of the novel agent. And if they selected the Learn deck, they were taught that it would reveal explanatory information about their moral categorization. And so on each trial, people see a moral agent, and then they select between those two kinds of information. And they see three total kinds of moral agents: good agents, which here's an example of a good person; ambiguous agents, here's an example of an ambiguous one; and then bad agents, here's an example of a bad one. Okay, so in total, people see 30 trials, 10 good, 10 ambiguous, and 10 bad, and they're, presented in completely random order. Okay, so we predicted overall that people rated as immoral, people that we've manipulated to be immoral, would elicit more curiosity than those who are good. We thought this would emerge for both immoral, like plainly immoral sorts of characters, but also for ambiguous ones as well. And then we tested some competing hypotheses that, so based on that Netflix data, we expected that we might see a linear effect, that the more immorality there is, the more interest that people display for learning real explanatory information about their moral categorization. But we also were interested in whether it's actually for the ambiguous characters or for the ambiguous agents where we see like the most peak in curiosity, because those are the ones that aren't really fully categorized as good or bad, maybe the ones that we would expect to have the most uncertainty around them. So we wanted to see which of those two things came out. So the moral character is on the x-axis, and then the probability of selecting that explanatory information is on the y-axis. And so what we find is that people are overall more interested in immorality than they are in morally good agents. And we see a relatively linear effect. So it doesn't seem to be the case that, at least in the context of this setup, that uncertainty or ambiguity is really driving interest in the same way as immorality. And I also want to note that, so the Learn deck also is more cognitively effortful. It takes people about 2 times as long to finish a trial for no financial incentive. So it really is just, curiosity. And we can also look at how these patterns differ across the course of the task. There are 30 trials. This is averaging across participants. And what I think is really interesting is when we look at the bad agents, we see that a pretty strong preference emerges over the course of the task, where people select more to learn that explanatory information more frequently. For the other ones, we see people sort of vacillating around the different options. And I've run a number of studies looking at this sort of effect, changing things like the choice set, changing the task so that you're choosing between different agents rather than different kinds of information. But all of these tasks that I've used have this similar kind of setup where you can select to learn more about a bad compared to an average or a good person. And we see relatively consistent effects across all of those sort of experimental changes. And so another question that I had is whether this, when we looked at that Netflix data, this is a massive time commitment. People seem to be interested in this. And so are they learning something from, what they're engaging in the moral domain? And so to test this question, we use a really similar paradigm, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. But instead of looking at the character level or the agent level, we looked at the action level. We manipulated the morality of a variety of actions, some of them extremely atypical, some of them really typical, good and bad, spanning the gamut of valence. And we gave people the option to choose to learn 2 kinds of causal explanations, one about how someone accomplished a particular moral action, and the other why, so like mental information. Really thinking that this draw is the draw that we see in the Netflix data and in the other experiments is really about gaining access to mind information for people who are moral deviants. And so at the bottom on the x-axis, we see the manipulation, so whether it's a bad or good action, and then memory accuracy is on the y-axis. And so overall, we see a general valence effect. People remember the bad things more than or better than they do the good things. And we also have a significant interaction. So we find that people remember the why information the best about immoral actions in particular. So there does seem to be something about this engaging mind information that seems to lead to some learning, at least memory. Okay, and in my last couple of minutes, I'm going to share some ongoing work that I'm doing that's really focused on another way to think about curiosity in the moral domain. So far we've looked at curiosity about, different moral agents or different moral actions, what kind of information people want to approach. But there is another way to think about curiosity in the moral domain, which is about other people's moral judgments. Like, when do I want to know what somebody else is thinking? Okay, so in this study, we developed this task where we show participants 3 real people. This is the example from the practice trial. But so we show them 3 real people that we had normed previously to be people that people are on average not super familiar with, like name familiarity, but don't know a lot about what they did. And there are people whose actions are relatively morally ambiguous. We had people read about the person, and then their goal was to make a guess about what other people would categorize that person's moral character as. So you can see here there's a slider scale. So, what percentage of people do you think would think this is good versus, or this person is good versus this person is bad? And so we show them a trial like that 3 different times. And when they see the agent, they report their curiosity about learning what other people think about this person. They report their confidence in their judgment. They make their estimate. And then they also provide their own moral judgment about that particular agent. And then they do a search task. So in this search task, participants are shown this grid of avatars. So right here, I'm just showing you two rows of the task, but it went, there are actually 100 avatars, so people could select up to 100 people. So you could scroll down like basically infinitely, although one person did select all 100. They're excluded from the data, but. For each avatar, participants could select, click on the avatar, and then they could see their real moral judgment. And these moral judgments do correspond to the actual average. So if you did select all 100, you could literally get the actual average, although again, only one person did that. People on average selected 4. And I should also note that this is, it's sort of a brutal task because there's a time delay also, so it's very effortful to select. It's about a 2-second delay before you see the agents or what the particular person had rated the moral character. Okay, and so after people are done searching, they can exit the search part, and then they do some post ratings. Okay, so what do we find? Well, we find that, maybe unsurprisingly, increases in self-reported curiosity about what other people think predict more searching in the task, and decreased confidence in your judgment about what other people think also predict increases in how many avatars people select. So people seem to seek more moral information about moral stimuli when they're curious or they're unsure. And in line with what data I've already shared with you, we also find, I think, this interesting effect where it seems that people are more interested in seeking information about those that they categorize as bad and less interested in those that they categorize as good. And so we've replicated those exact patterns in a larger sample, and we get exactly the same results. The effects get a little bit stronger in the larger sample. And we're also interested in whether one explanation might be that when things are good, when I already think somebody is good, it doesn't really matter what other people think about that. Goodness sort of stands on its own. But when I think something might be bad, there's maybe reputation involved, there's maybe more uncertainty around that more volatile kind of judgment in general. And so maybe when I don't think that their particular actions were justified exclusively on the bad side, we would see this sort of negative effect emerge. And that is exactly what we found. So people seek out more information about bad people only when they think that whatever they did was not a justified action. There's like something left to be explained. Okay, and I have a ton of results about belief updating because they do make these post judgments. They're a little messy, and I'm excited to talk about them over hopefully the coffee break, but I'll give you a short preview, which is that people's curiosity ratings do not predict their updating judgments at all, not their own moral judgment updated judgments, or those about what they think other people think, so these sort of meta judgments either. Certainty does, but it also does not mediate the relationship between curiosity and updating. So there's a lot going on here that I'm interested to unpack. Okay, so this is just a couple concluding points, but I'll end now just thanking my collaborators, you all for listening, my funders, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordan. Any questions?
Yeah. Thank you. That's really fascinating. I'm wondering, is one possibility that people have kind of, maybe it's equally important for us to know how to handle situations with good moral people interactions and bad ones, but we may experience more of the good ones, so we may be better at understanding them, and so therefore we seek information about the bad ones when we have a chance. Is there a way that you could test that with your data, like maybe people, maybe it's correct for them to seek less information about the good ones because they're actually already accurate at judging what other people would think, but for the bad ones, they're less accurate, so they need to seek information?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So I can check that in my data, and I have looked at it, at least looking at like, so a participant has a judgment, and then I know the true value, how far are they away on either side, are they more negative or more positive? And we don't see a ton of consistent patterns there when we look across the two studies. That I'll admit, just sort of binned people. I haven't looked at it in a continuous way, though I could. So at least when I'm binning people, I don't see really informative things come out, but I think there is certainly something there. There's some work by Hans Alves and others on the diversity of negativity compared to like the similarity among things that are positive. And I think that is sort of undergirding some of the results that we see. So I do share your intuition, although my data don't really bear it out in the ways that I expected anyway. Yep, the Anna Karenina quip, I think, totally fits here, yeah.
Right, okay, so thanks, Ethan. That was my first question. So,
perfect.
So now I'm going to ask my second question, which is off the wall. Is there any work on indignation? So, you often look at that bad person and then you shake your head and it's like, oh, they're so bad. I'd never do this. So it makes you feel a lot better about yourself. Is there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know of work about it. I do think a little bit that is happening in my data as well. And so some of the studies we've asked about like the self and how this makes you feel about yourself, and the bad ones exclusively make people feel better about themselves. So I think that's going on. Of course, when people learn about moral saints or things like that, they don't report that. But I think another interesting thing we find there is that although it makes people feel sort of better about themselves, they don't find it satisfying. I think harkening back to the talk we heard earlier. So people report that although, yeah, it makes them feel good, like they ultimately are sort of negative about the fact that there are people who do that, and learning about that is unsatisfying to them, which is sort of a peculiar effect. Maybe they don't want to admit. That's also totally possible, especially I think in the moral domain. We have like to battle some social desirability things a little bit more. Yeah.
I think you may have addressed most of my questions, but I actually want to follow up on that point because I'm wondering about the person level motivations for belief updating and learning, especially in your memory finding. So do you have any signal as to whether, if your psychological distance from the bad actor or other characteristics modulate how much people update? Like, is it serving the function of checking to see, do I like who I am in relation to this person? And is that reflected in the learning signal?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So in the information seeking paradigm, I don't have any measures that could get at that. In the other paradigm, I do. And it is the case that people who feel closer to people who are bad are most interested in them. So we do see some of that happening, although we still see the overall effect even among people who do want to sort of distance themselves, which I think is pretty striking. Yeah.
Any final quick questions?
I'm curious whether you think you would see similar findings, particularly like this preference for seeking out why information for other types of social norm violations that aren't necessarily immoral.
Yeah. In one of the studies, we manipulate like the typicality of the action, and we find that actions that are more atypical also elicit this sort of drive. But it's greatest among those that are both immoral and atypical. And I've contrasted directly with other social norm violations. And again, you do see a general approach towards those atypical things, but there's something special, at least in how I've designed these studies, about the moral badness that seems to really draw people in. And I think it's somewhat related to what you're talking about, like the true crime, those sorts of drives. I think true crime is really popular for a reason, and we're seeing that sort of reflected in these data. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Following an inspiring morning session, we have now Caroline Charpenter to start the next session, telling us about a Bayesian belief updating account of confirmation bias during advice seeking and integration.
Right, thanks everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. So today I'm going to talk about advice seeking and advice integration. So we all frequently rely on advice coming from others when we make decisions. I'm sure you can all remember situations from your own life where you've had to integrate a doctor's advice with your own internet searches about a health concern, or consulted a financial advisor to decide how to invest some savings, or maybe rely on a political analyst as well as some social media posts to decide who to vote for. Yet, these processes by which we seek and integrate advice from others can be biased. For example, vaccine skeptics might disregard doctors' recommendations and follow advice from less qualified sources. Investors might focus on their preferred stock and fail to diversify. Or voters can dismiss political analysis that contradict their prior beliefs. And so there's been a lot of previous seminal work that has looked into these biases and kind of characterize them, and especially depending on the context and also people's personality. People might, in general, favor their own belief and disregard advice. That's kind of the examples I gave were all related to that a little bit, and that's been shown in evidence as this concept of egocentric discounting. On the other hand, we also have a potential other side of this bias where people could blindly follow the advice regardless of the context or even when they shouldn't. So this could be because advice especially is a form of social information that tends to be perceived as more trustworthy than maybe other ways that social information can be framed. And it's also generally more concrete, available, and salient, right? Compared to having to sort of deploy the cognitive effort to access your prior belief and learn from them. Advice can be just one piece of information that comes to you, and that's very easy to follow. And that's actually been shown as one potential mechanism, this sort of hypersalience hypothesis, where we sometimes see in schizophrenia over-reliance of the prior being one mechanism, but also sometimes this sort of blindly following advice as following this hypersalient advice. And then as another dimension of this, which is why I call it differently, we also see this idea of selectively favoring advice that confirms one's prior belief, right? Regardless of whether this advice is accurate or regardless of its quality. And this will lead to preference for like-minded advisor, or for selective exposure to confirmatory information, which has been shown to contribute to echo chamber and polarization and so on. So in this talk, I want to take this sort of two-dimensional view of biased advice taking. On the one hand, as I said, we had this dimension by which people might overweigh the advice at one extreme versus overweigh their prior beliefs. And then in this sort of potentially orthogonal dimension, we can have this sort of more optimal behavior of favoring advice that's just accurate, and that's the quality of the advice is the only factor that drives us to seek and integrate it, versus being biased towards advice that confirms our prior belief, regardless of accuracy. So what I'm asking in this talk is essentially, is this view supported empirically? This sort of two-dimensional view, and are those dimensions actually orthogonal or not? And can we identify this sort of two separate computational mechanisms that underlie those two forms of confirmation bias? And if so, are the individual differences in these biases relevant to various processes, including metacognitive sensitivity and mental health symptoms? Okay, so to do this, we designed a task that's loosely based on the BEATS task, if some of you are familiar with it. People on each trial see an urn. They know that all urns are 60-40. They just don't know which majority color, and that's their task, right? They have to guess whether the majority color of the urn is yellow or blue. And they see an initial draw, so this is to operationalize the prior belief, and that draw varies from 1 to 3 balls in different color combination that will influence the strength of the prior. And on 1/3 of the trial, they make a guess right away, so we can kind of quantify those prior beliefs. So they guess which is the majority color and how confident they are about their guess. And then the trial goes on where they receive advice from one of 2 advisors, and I'll talk a bit more about the advisors in a minute. And then they see an outcome where they can essentially see if they won or lost, if their guess was correct, but also whether or not the advisor's advice was accurate. So this is the type of trial where we assess the prior belief because participants' responses are measured before they receive the advice. And the 2 other type of trial, we measure their posterior beliefs because they give their guess and confidence after seeing the advice, so we can sort of see how their guesses and confidence integrate the prior and the advice. And then the 3rd type of trial is also posterior belief, but we added an active advice-seeking component where people actively choose between the 2 advisors. And so we can also quantify what are the drivers that will lead people to choose one advisor over the other. And then they get the advice from the advisors they chose and rate their guess and confidence again. So those 2 highlighted processes is essentially, this is the step where we can look at advice seeking, and then their guess and confidence after receiving advice. It helps us look at advice integration. And so the contingencies of this task were such that we could dissociate essentially confirmatory versus accurate advice, because obviously in real life they're often confounded. They are still a little bit confounded in this task because we still wanted to be realistic in terms of respecting the contingencies driven by the underlying probabilities of the urn. One thing I didn't mention is that participants were told that the advisors could had access to a prior draw that had more balls than they could see, so something like 3 to 5, versus the participants themselves can only see 1 to 3. So they know that the advisors have more information, but also they won't always be accurate because it's not like they can see the whole urn. And so at that stage is when we can decide whether the advice might confirm or disconfirm the prior belief. So here the prior belief would be yellow because it has more yellow balls than blue balls in the initial draw. And then that second stage is where participants can learn whether the advice was accurate or not, depending on the outcome versus the advice they received. And the two advisors were sort of dissociated to the extent possible, as I just said, such that one tended to be more accurate and less confirmatory, and the other advisor was more confirmatory and less accurate. So we collected this data on Prolific, a bit over 500 participants. Participants were also pre-screened to be matched over like political beliefs. I'm not really going to talk about this because this is part of a bigger project that I'll briefly mention at the end, but I'm not going to look at this data directly. And they were pretty matched on sex and covered a wide age range as well. Okay, so looking into the behaviors, what were the factors that drove people's decisions to seek advice from one or the other advisor? And so to do that, we ran a mixed effect logistic regression to predict the choice of advisor from two predictors. One was essentially how accurate each advisor was since the last trial where participants had to pick an advisor because they only do so roughly on a third of trials. And the other one was the difference in their confirmatory tendencies. So again, counting how much confirmatory advice was received by each advisor and looking whether that difference drives their choice. And so what we found is that both were significant drivers of behavior. So accuracy tended to have a slightly stronger effect, and people were definitely learning about this. But once accuracy was accounted for, there was still some effect of the advisor's confirmatory tendencies in driving participants' choices. Now, looking at advice integration parts, so to do that, we looked at participants' guesses of the majority color. And we could check whether those guesses are influenced by the prior beliefs. So essentially, are you more likely to guess yellow when there were more yellow beads in the prior draw? Whether they're driven by advice, so whether the advice was for yellow or not. And also we looked at this in an interaction with which advisor gave the advice. So sort of going again with this idea that maybe people show some differences in whether they're biased, they integrate information from an advisor more strongly than the other one. And so these were the results. So those two first effects shows that there are significant effects of both the prior and the advice when making a guess. But we also saw, so this was kind of expected, people are learning and they're integrating those two factors. But we also saw not super strong, but significant interaction between the advice and the advisor. And actually this interaction went into the direction of the most optimal behaviors. So participants did integrate the advice from the more accurate advisor more strongly than advice from the other advisor. But we see there's like high variability, and there are some people who show an interaction in the other direction. So then we turned into modeling to kind of test our two-dimensional view and see if we could come up with a framework where we have those two forms of confirmation bias modeled as separate parameters. And there are two types of beliefs in this task that needs to be modeled. One are the beliefs about the advisors that is learned throughout the task because the advisor stays the same. And one is the belief about the urn's majority color, which is reset on each trial, and participants are told that each urn is independent on every new trial. And so we use a Bayesian framework to model these beliefs, sort of using the property of this beta binomial update, so modeling belief probability as a beta distribution that gets updated as new evidence comes in. And we tested 4 models, kind of influenced by our two-dimensional view. There was an optimal model, which I'll describe in a minute, which essentially both assumed that people will equally weigh the prior and the advice, and they're only driven by the accuracy of the advisor. And then we could modify this model by injecting either a bias towards confirmatory advice or a bias towards either the prior or towards the advice and how they're integrated together. And our full model had both of these biases combined. So I might move a little bit fast on this given time constraint, and I'm happy to talk more about the models if anyone's interested. But essentially, as I said, our optimal learner updates beliefs about the advisor only based on their propensity to be accurate. So for each advisor, the probability, the belief that the advisor is accurate is driven by those alpha and beta parameters of the beta distribution that gets incremented by 1 on every trial that participants either get evidence that the advisor was accurate or evidence that they were inaccurate. And so this will shift the beta distribution towards the advisor's true accuracy over time. And then we could model their choice of picking an advisor. So on those third of trials where participants make an active choice between the two advisors, we can predict those choices with a softmax. And then to make a guess, participants will integrate essentially information about their prior, which is essentially the number of yellow or blue balls that they observe, and they'll integrate that with their beliefs about the advisor, right? So if their advice is yellow, this is constitute evidence towards yellow that's modulated by how accurate you think the advisor is. And those essentially prior belief and belief about the advice accuracy can be integrated into those posterior beliefs that gets you to shift your beliefs towards whether yellow or blue is more likely to be the majority color. And again, we have a softmax to kind of quantify stochasticity there. Okay, and so in our second model, we integrate a bias whereby the initial belief, so the belief about the advisor, is no longer only driven by the propensity of the advisor to be accurate, but also by their confirmatory tendencies. And so now those beliefs about advisor I are kind of a linear combination of the accuracy evidence and the confirmatory evidence driven by a parameter eta that quantifies this relative weighting of accurate versus confirmatory advice. But in this model, the second part of integrating the prior and advice remained equal, so unbiased, if you wish. Now, our third model did the opposite. So the belief about the advisors were only driven by accuracy, like in the optimal model, while the belief about the majority color were differentially weighted, allowed differential weighting of the prior versus advice. So again, now we don't just have those two beliefs summed equally, but we allow them to vary based on this other three parameters. And in our full model, Model 4 had both of these biases included to sort of map onto this two-dimensional view. So we jointly fit our models on both the advisor choice and the guess decisions, because the models can predict both type of choices. And we found that both using AIC or even BIC to penalize for extra parameter more, the full model performed best. And we're able to explain about 40% of decisions overall, which is decently good, especially that it's a pretty short task, so they don't have a lot of time to learn. All right, so getting into our bias parameter distribution, what kind of insights can we get from the parameter values? So our gamma parameter is the parameter that quantifies the extent to which people are biased towards the prior or towards their advice. And we see a lot of variability, but overall the mean is over 1, meaning that participants tend to display a bias towards their prior, which is consistent, I think, with past literature. But we'll see if this individual variability might be relevant in some ways. Now, the second bias, eta, kind of confirms a little bit our GLM results from the beginning, where we do see that it's different from the median here, but it's actually biased towards accuracy, so kind of still suggesting to us that participants are trying to deploy a somewhat optimal strategy to learn this task, because they'll perform better if they learn more about the accurate, if they integrate accurate advice more strongly. But obviously, we see that the integration is not perfect, so the optimal model here would be this being very close to 1, and so there's still some residual effect of being biased towards confirmation, and about a third of our participants actually weigh these confirmatory tendencies more. Now the question was, can this confirm our two views, our two-dimensional view, and are those two parameters correlated with each other? So do people who weigh their prior more strongly are also more biased towards confirmation? And we actually don't find that this is the case, right? So we really find there's maybe fewer people in this quadrant here, but essentially there's no significant correlation whatsoever between those two biases. So kind of confirming our potential orthogonality of these two forms of confirmation bias, and that they might, rely and deploy different cognitive processes. And so moving on to a slightly part two, where we want to look a bit at whether those individual differences are meaningful at all. There's a whole bunch of analysis that I'm not showing in this talk for the sake of time, where we do find that individual differences in those biases are related to behavioral indices in the task. But this is more of a sanity check, I guess. So I'm not really showing it, but if people are interested, I'm happy to show the data later. And what we're going to look into is a little bit whether those participants can be clustered in different groups, and whether those groups might differ on different separate metrics, essentially. So we perform clustering on these two parameters as our input variables. And we actually find pretty robust clustering solution that 3 separate clusters emerge. And then we're still doing a lot more validation to see whether that's stable, but it seems pretty stable as a clustering solution so far. You'll see the distributions are not exactly the same, because those are the raw parameters that are more normally distributed than those transformed one. But this is just a methodological thing. And so essentially what we found in those 3 clusters is that we had cluster 1 is essentially our maybe most like optimal, the cluster of people that's closest to the optimal behavior, which would be somewhere around up here. So being more biased towards accuracy rather than confirmatory advice, though they still show bias towards the prior overall. Cluster 2 is this group of people in green where that is both biased towards their prior, but also overweight confirmatory advice. And then this group in blue is essentially a group that tends to just be biased towards their advice. So maybe this idea of blindly following the advice and not so much integrating the prior into the beliefs. So finally, we're going to look at how those 3 clusters differ from one another. Both on 2 metrics. So one is metacognitive sensitivity, because we have confidence rating, and we can maybe look if there are differences in how people integrate uncertainty into their confidence ratings. And also symptoms relevant to psychopathology as a potential application of this work. So we run a separate analysis to look at how variables that are predicted from a model can influence and predict confidence ratings. And specifically, we focused on 2 trial-by-trial variables that are derived from our full model that incorporate the biases. So one is belief width, because beliefs are modeled as this beta distribution. We can, for each trial, calculate the variance of that distribution in the beliefs. And so the wider the beliefs, the more uncertain people should be, and probably the less confident they should be. And we can also compute choice difficulty, which turns out to be pretty decorrelated. And choice difficulty would be how close is the choice from 0.5, is the mean of that distribution, right? So if I believe the probability, my belief of yellow being the majority color is very close to 0.5, that's a very difficult choice because I'm close to the 0.5 probability. And then we want to look at whether those effects predict confidence and whether they interact with the 3 clusters, so whether they're different in our 3 groups. And so this is the regression they run, and this is the results. So I'll break it down. So first of all, I wanted to highlight that even though this is a pretty simple model, we can explain quite a lot of variance in confidence rating by just these 2 variables and their interaction with cluster. And the main effect is that essentially confidence decreases with both choice difficulty and belief uncertainty, which is not surprising, but kind of interesting to see that both variables uniquely predict variance in confidence ratings. And then the other effect is the interaction with clusters, right? And what's driving this interaction is essentially that individuals in the blue group here, which are individuals who overweigh the advice, relative to the prior, they also show reduced sensitivity to uncertainty when rating their confidence. And this might be related to what I mentioned at the beginning, where maybe people who blindly follow the advice have used more of this availability heuristic because the advice is kind of readily available in the task and they can just very easily follow it, and they don't really need to integrate the uncertainty of their belief in their confidence. And so those two processes might be related in that way. And note that there was no significant difference in mean confidence between clusters, even though it looks like maybe the green cluster is shifted up compared to the red cluster, that effect wasn't significant. All right, and last slide, we're looking at potentially relevance to social anxiety and autistic traits, which has been something that I've been quite interested in my lab, given that the two dimensions tend to be really positively associated in the population. They can cause challenge during diagnosis, but it could be that maybe people with high social anxiety and people with high autistic trait seek and integrate advice in different ways. We also had a few other potentially relevant symptoms that we integrated and looked into. And this is just the questionnaires we used, and we had a slightly smaller data set after excluding people who respond carelessly on those questionnaires. And so we actually found significant differences in both social anxiety and autistic traits. For social anxiety, the difference was mostly driven by the first versus third cluster, so essentially social anxiety being higher in individuals who overweigh the advice, which again could relate to this availability heuristic, but also to a desire to fit in as higher social anxiety and to just follow what other people tell you. Whereas the autistic trait were found to be highest in the second cluster, which is the cluster that's specifically characterized by a bias towards confirmatory advice. And so this could relate to the cognitive rigidity dimension that's quite important in autism. Those effects survive controlling for age and sex, and there was also no difference in the other symptoms I briefly mentioned. So just to briefly conclude, essentially we do find this strong positive association between autistic trait and social anxiety in our sample, but yet if we plot the mean symptoms per cluster, we kind of find this nice dissociation there where it's almost like we're pulling apart the variance where we can identify a group with sort of higher social anxiety and lower autistic traits versus the opposite group, just based on clustering from our two model parameters. All right, so to conclude, we provide this novel computational model of biased advice seeking and integration that characterizes two separate and orthogonal dimensions, the extent to which people weigh confirmatory versus accurate advice, and the extent to which they're biased towards their prior or towards the advice. And we see quite a lot of relevance of these individual profiles with those three groups. This group especially could be interesting in the sense of both favoring advice, having reduced metacognitive sensitivity, and higher social anxiety. And our red group is essentially, as I said, the most optimally behaving group, which also happened to show the lowest mental health symptoms. And so in future work, I hope to kind of apply this computational account to maybe decisions that are a bit more relevant to real life, like I mentioned at the beginning, health, financial, or political decisions. And with this, I want to thank people who were involved in this work. It's been a long process. So I started this project, I think, in 2020 when I was still at Caltech. Had to pause it for a bit. There is a related preprint if you're interested that doesn't have any of the modeling, but where the task was used in a larger battery to examine conspiracy beliefs and how they might relate to some of these processes as well as other tasks. And then I had a really talented undergrad, Yi, who joined my lab last year and kind of helped with a lot of the modeling and helped taking this project to the finish line. So I'm very happy for any feedback and any questions. Thank you.
Two, I think, interrelated questions. One is, if people are overconfident and if they put too much weight on their own, what they observe, is it possible that the weight on that confirmatory, like the desire for confirmatory advice, is really just also desire for accurate advice because they think that the confirmatory advice is accurate because of these two other biases? Mm-hmm. And the other question is, it seems to me that people usually like confirmatory advice when they face conflicts between what they want to do and what they think that they should do. And they like, in that situation, they like to get advice that kind of licenses them to do what they want to do. And so that seems kind of missing in your paradigm.
Yeah.
So I think it kind of understates like
Yeah.
the importance of confirmatory.
Yeah, no, totally. I think, so the first question, I guess at least in our task, we have the possibility of a ground truth, which I agree in real life is often missing. So, you know, we're able to separate those two needs in that way. But yeah, totally agree that in terms of the confidence itself as a driver, for believing that the confirmatory advice is more accurate is probably definitely there in, like, maybe it relates a bit to Ethan's talk about the evolutionary need for that. And then the second point, I think this is why moving towards more naturalistic decision or real life situation is needed for this, right? So this is like, yeah, a shortened framework to kind of identify those dimensions, but we need to extend it to more real life decisions to look into this for sure.
Yeah, thanks, really interesting. So first I just want to confirm, people were choosing which advisor they wanted to get advice from? Mm-hmm. Did you see anything about the like differences in why people would choose one versus the other type of advisor?
I mean, we have, let me see if I have this plot. People tend to choose the accurate advisor a little more. I think I have this slide, which I took out for time reason. Yeah, so this is just the baseline choice, the distribution of the propensity of choosing the confirmatory advisor more. I think it's only calculated on the second half of the task because I'm assuming people need time to learn about the advisors. And so we do see a significant difference where people are a bit biased towards the more accurate advice. So that's kind of relates to the modeling results as well, where, you know, there is some people who prefer the confirmatory, but overall they are performing this task, you know, towards learning that one of the advisors is slightly more accurate and starting to prefer this advisor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Was it related at all to how much they actually used, like
confidence or
the correct, accurate one or the confirmatory one? Like were the computational model parameters related to which one they actually chose?
I actually haven't looked at this correlation. Yeah, maybe I will. It's a good point. So the extent to which, like, if they're integrating advice from that advisor more strongly, are they also choosing it more?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that could be a good thing to look at. And I will say, though, that's why we had the task where they only actively choose the advisor on 1/3 of the trial, because we didn't want there to be too much of a bias. Because obviously, if they always choose the same advisor, they can only integrate information from that advisor, right? So that might create a bias in the exposure, where you're becoming more exposed to one advisor compared to the other. So at least we have 2/3 of trials where the exposure is balanced, so at least we have some control there. Yeah, so yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, breeding work. Yeah, I noticed that we are fitting bias parameters throughout the game. I'm wondering if it's possible then people might dynamically adjust their weights on prior versus advice. Let's say I might be really confident in the beginning, but then I realized I was making some really bad decisions, and then I start to rely on advice more. I'm not sure if we consider that kind of.
I don't think we have the power to test the dynamics in this design. It's a pretty short task. There's only 60 trials. I think it's about 15 minutes, 20 minutes max. It goes pretty fast, so I don't think we'd have the power to test this, but it would be cool to maybe design a slightly longer version or inject some manipulation that would maybe switch people's like strategies as time progresses, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you so much to the organizers for such an amazing community building meeting and the opportunity to speak today. I wanted to start by noting that this idea of information as an intrinsic reward actually poses a problem. And that is, how does the brain recognize what is information? How does it identify and assign value to potential sources of information like these books? External rewards fulfill physiological needs, and they elicit reinforcement through physiological processes that activate specific ensembles of neurons and lead to value representations. But information is defined by cognition. The desire for information and which sensory stimuli are most informative depend on current knowledge. And so determining how the brain recognizes and assigns value to information is this difficult problem of metacognition. And moreover, if, as Ethan showed in his really early work, the same dopaminergic neurons respond to juice and respond to information, there must be other distinct pathways that recognize and assign value to information. And so I've started to address this problem by asking if I can discern a representation of the intrinsic value of information in the mouse cortex. And that's so that I can use the tools of rodent systems neuroscience to probe into the circuit and start to get at these really elusive questions. So we've adapted what is this now canonical non-instrumental information-seeking task for the mouse by using odor cues. So water-deprived mice enter a center nose poke port. On each trial, they receive an odor there. One odor directs them to the left reward port, one odor directs them to the right reward port. The left port is the information port, the right port is the no information port. In this initial version of the task, both ports offer an identical 25% probability of water reward. At the information side port, the mouse receives a second odor. This is either odor A that indicates a rewarded trial and is always followed by water reward. Odor B indicates an unrewarded trial. At the no information port, the mouse receives odor C or odor D, which offer no information and are each followed by that 25% probability of water reward. After mice have learned this part of the task, after several weeks of training, we introduce a third odor at the center port that gives them the free choice between information and no information. And so their behavior on these trials is how we're going to measure the preference for information and information seeking in the mice. Within each animal, we reverse the side location of the information. So we know that they're choosing information and not biased towards a particular left or right side. And the mice can't make the task go faster. Their actions cannot allow them to get any additional water reward. They have to wait for a 10-second delay after the odor in the side port and the reward outcome. And we've done a bunch of different controls to convince ourselves that they are choosing the information side to eliminate their uncertainty rather than to, say, respond differentially to the odors they receive there based on their association with water reward. I could talk about those later. And so I observed that the mice have a strong preference, and they clearly prefer the information side port. So each of these bars shows the mean preference of an individual animal with information on either side. Across the population, there's a strong preference for the information port. The mice choose it about 68% of the time. And we didn't observe mice with an anti-information preference in this version of the task. This is a really complicated task for mice. These animals that don't look like they have information preference are just side biased, and they don't get it, right? Now, this choice preference suggests that information has value to a mouse. We wanted to ask if, at some level, the information is exchangeable for physiological water reward, if mice are willing to pay for information. And so we decreased the water amount that's provided in the information port in blocks of sessions. So here's the preference at that initial condition where the two sides have equal water reward value. As we decrease the water reward amount, we see that the animals are still choosing the information side. So the mice are willing to sacrifice a substantial amount of the available water to receive this information. And we fit a reinforcement learning-based decision model, much like others have talked about. And our best fitting model does indeed need an additive term for the value of information, which suggests that mice are computing this separate value of information in their behavioral choices. And so together, our behavioral experiments showed that information is of intrinsic value to a mouse. And this suggests that there may be a neural representation of information involved in their decision. We can ask whether that looks like value. And to do this, we have imaged neural activity. We use miniaturized microscopes in animals performing our task. And we have looked in the orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC. And so OFC is thought to represent, among other things, the predicted value of choice options during economic decision making. It also receives a really strong direct projection from primary olfactory cortex. And recordings in a conceptually different flavor of information-seeking task have identified single neurons in OFC in the monkey that respond to predicted information. So we thought that OFC is a really good place to look for a representation in rodent cortex of the predicted value of information. And so to do this, we're going to look at the responses to these center port odors, which differentially predict information and no information. And the responses I'll show you to these odors are balanced across sessions in which the information is on the right and on the left. And that's because we, like others, observe extensive mixed selectivity in these cortical neurons. So individual cells respond to and care about both the side direction of the animal's choice as well as the prediction of information. And so by looking at and pooling responses across sessions, and I should say we're able to do this because we registered cells across many sessions of recording and many days of training, so I know I'm looking at the same cell from day to day. And by pooling data across these side reversals, we're able to disambiguate representations of the prediction of information from this side direction response as well as the odor identity, right? So the information responses I'm showing you are actually responses to multiple different odors. And so here are the responses we observed across the 1,138 cells we've recorded in 7 different animals to the information predicting center port odors. And we see responses to these odors in about 40% of all OFC cells. Here are the responses of the same cells to the no information predicting odors, and then the difference between them, and that which is how they're sorted. You can read each cell across the columns. And we considered that across the OFC population, the prediction of information could be encoded by differential responses to information and no information predicting odors in either direction, right? And so we see these significantly differential responses to information and no information prediction in about 20% of OFC cells. And we quantified this using an information coding index that sort of accounts for this directional difference in encoding. And this coding index increases after the presentation of the center port odor and diverges significantly between information and no information trials. And so we consider this response a representation predictive of information in the mouse orbitofrontal cortex. And so it's a representation of predicted information, but if that representation also reflects the preference of the animals to receive information, we should be able to predict choices to receive information on a trial-by-trial basis from neural activity alone. And we could do that. So we trained a linear classifier to distinguish information from no information predicted trials at the time of this center port odor, and we're able to decode that successfully in data recorded simultaneously within individual animals, as well as in a pseudopopulation pooled across the group. We have really high accuracy, so we're able to decode with about 70% accuracy on these forced information versus no information trials, and we have about 68% accuracy if we look just at the choice trials, carefully balancing for those left and right sides. And so we think this means that the neural activity reflects the animal's choice to receive information on a trial-by-trial basis. And we wanted to understand then whether this is a representation that is actually like a scalar value signal of the subjective value of information to the animal and the intrinsic value of information that might be based on uncertainty. And so we wanted to manipulate the amount of uncertainty in the task. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. The way that we chose that we thought was easy for the animals to understand was by varying the delay between the provision of information at that side port odor and the actual water reward outcome. And so this determines the duration of uncertainty the animal is able to avoid by choosing to receive information. And so we again did this in a systematic way. We found that mice became indifferent to the information at shorter delays of around 1 to 4 seconds. We again fit our RL decision model, and that information value term, we can add a scaling parameter with the duration of the delay. And then we looked at the neural activity. And so here is that information coding index across the population in sessions with the original long 10-second delay when the mice really strongly prefer to receive information. When we look at sessions with a 1-second delay when the animals are no longer seeking information, the same cells still seem to be encoding the prediction of information, but the magnitude of that differential signal is decreased. And across the population, this differential signal for information versus no information trials decreases with a shorter delay in which the animals are no longer seeking information, and there's a shorter duration of uncertainty to avoid. And so we think this really does reflect the scalar signal of the intrinsic value of information in the task. And so if information innately has intrinsic value to a mouse, we might predict that a distinct pathway has evolved to represent that value. And so we wanted to ask whether our information prediction representation might be distinct from a representation of canonical physiological value. For example, in our task, in the representation of predicted water reward. We looked at this in 2 different ways. The one I'll show you today is that we added 2 additional trial types. So we added trials where an odor at that center port predicts a certain large amount of water reward, and a different odor predicts a certain small amount of water reward. We also included that side reversal again here. And so we're able to look at the exact same task epic at representations of odors that predict information versus no information, and odors that predict a large and small value of water reward. And we again did this with the population-based decoding analysis. So we train a classifier to decode information from no information, and then we train a distinct and independent classifier to decode large and small value predicted water reward. And when we look at how neurons within the population contribute to these 2 different classifiers, the weighting or the loading of the contribution of each cell to the 2 different classifiers is totally unrelated. They're not correlated, which suggests that these axes that encode predicted water value and predicted information value are actually nearly orthogonal in the OFC population state space. And moreover, if we look at the cells that are most important for decoding predicted information and predicted water reward value, they're quite distinct. And this is consistent with the existence of this distinct representation of predicted intrinsic information value. I'll skip over this because I don't have that much time, but I want to come back to this sort of provocative, elusive question. And so I didn't show you the data, but we observed that this information representation emerges with learning. So in the absence of a value association, piriform cortex, which represents odor identity, projects to orbitofrontal cortex, and there's nearly no response to odors in OFC until they take on meaning by association with value. And since the information, the water value representations are quite distinct, this suggests that the piriform to OFC input is perhaps uniquely reinforced by the receipt of information. And so we have this hypothesis there may be these as yet unknown neural ensembles that recognize that odors in our task provide information and elicit reinforcement of the odor to OFC input to generate the value representation. And we're now looking for the identity of those ensembles. We think that's going to be a really important next step to understanding the circuit. And so with that, I'll thank my PI, Richard Axel, our collaborators. All these data are available in our preprint, and take any questions.
Hi, Jennifer. Great talk. Thanks. Did you find correlations between the strength of the information signal and the mouse preference, maybe across days or? And also, this also relates to the delay experiment. Did the behavioral preference for information increase? Because you showed that the signal in your cells increases, maybe the preference increased where they're correlated.
Yeah, so in the delay experiment, right, like across the group of mice, the preference kind of, it decreases with a lower delay, and the neural signal kind of goes with that. In terms of like, does the signal, like on average in a given animal, like the strength of the representation kind of match their preference? We didn't really look directly at that, but like when we do the decoding, right, and we're able to kind of predict a choice from the neural activity, that's kind of how we took the ability to predict and associate those 2 things.
Sorry, so the classification accuracy that you showed, oh, that was for decoding the choice of info versus...
Yeah, so I showed you the plot for the forced trials. The decoding doesn't work quite as well when we do choice trials because we have so few choices of no information. And so once you kind of precisely balance left, right, info, no info across all the choice trials, you just lose your number of trials. But we still get really good accuracy. So on the free choices, we're able to predict, is the mouse going to go to information or no information based just on the neural activity?
Great talk. I just wonder if you could talk about the training duration here and how you think this relates to information, say in novel object recognition or something, right, which you don't train to the same extent.
Yeah, so these guys are about as overtrained as you can get, right? So it takes, we spend kind of several weeks teaching them the earlier stages. Then we actually explicitly teach them this odor means you can go to either side. This side bias business is a thing that you constantly have to work against with mice. They're notoriously like that. And then we kind of reveal to them, oh, you can now make choices. And they spend about a week kind of making their initial choices, then we flip the sides, they do that, and then as we do additional manipulations, they just keep going and going. So none of it is new, right? It's literally just the outcome of that trial.
Thank you for the introduction. Hi everyone, my name is Humble. I'm very glad to present one of our most recent research. So far, the conference majorly presents work about human and animal exploration. So I would like to bring a little bit different view about machine exploration. So as you probably know that there might be a bunch of popular work recently that trying to understand the large language model's cognition. For example, such as decision-making, analogical reasoning, theory of mind, or any other domains. Despite what exactly cognitive domains they are kind of interested in, I want to make a parallel between the framework we understand human cognition and machine cognition. For example, we can use behavior experiments, computational modeling to understand the behavior and computational mechanisms, and neural imaging tools like fMRI or intervention tools like TMS to understand the neural and causal substrates. And we can even use think-aloud, right, to understand the process level information. However, in large language models, we can use something very similar. For example, we can also use behavior experiment and computational modeling. And we can also use something like feature mapping and feature steering, and also channels so in the large language models. However, in this of cognition, exploration is actually a very crucial intelligent capacity. I believe everyone is very familiar with this kind of cover story, such as from which restaurant you want to choose, or to open-ended scientific exploration, right? So exploration is actually everything in our life. So how does human explore? I think a general takeaway is just like humans can actually balance exploration strategies in both banded tasks and in open-ended tasks. But what about large language models? Some of the research has suggested that large language models explore suboptimally in banded tasks. So the question remains as, what about in some tasks like open-ended tasks? In our research, we focus on 3 different questions. First, we want to understand can large language models explore effectively in an open-ended task? And then we want to understand what kind of exploration strategies do they employ, especially compared to humans. And also, why do large language models succeed or fail compared to humans? So here we use an experimental task called Little Alchemy 2, which in this task, there are 4 initial elements, just like water, fire, air, and earth. So the goal for this task is trying to combine the elements to create new elements. So the goal is trying to combine as more elements as possible to create new elements. So in the large language models, we prompted the trial history that the large language model itself experienced, as well as the current available inventory they can use, and ask the large language model. So now, what kind of inventory combination you want to choose? So we compare the performance across 500 trials, that how many elements that each large language models and humans can discover in the task. And we generally find that traditional large language models generally underperforms humans, while reasoning models outperforms than humans. So then we try to use computational modeling to understand the mechanism. Here we focus on two different metrics. So one we call uncertainty. Here we define how often a certain combination is used in the past. Another we call empowerment, which means how likely a certain combination can produce a new element. To give you a sense of that, for example, the element human can actually produce consequential 83 elements, while the element alien can only produce one element. So we can call the human element has high empowerment, while alien element has a lower empowerment. We regress these two different metrics to predict their choices. And we generally find out that traditional large language models primarily use uncertainty-driven exploration rather than empowerment. So this is quite different than humans. But also, interestingly, reasoning models both show higher uncertainty-driven and empowerment-driven exploration. Thus, can explain why their performance are better than humans. We also do some mechanism analysis, just trying to scan the brain of the large language models. And we find out that the uncertainty and the choices, those values are majorly represented in the earlier blocks of the models, while the empowerment is majorly represented in the later models. So we can somehow the model just think too fast to explore effectively to use the empowerment. Our intervention also confirmed this role of empowerment and uncertainty. We also analyze the channel of thought patterns between traditional models and reasoning models, and we generally find that reasoning models can think deeper and harder, and they explore in the mental space more roughly. And interestingly, even when it comes to the final choice, the reasoning model can still have some probabilities to go back to check some other elements or to go some other spaces. So this exhibits a human-like back-tracing reasoning pattern. So to take away for our research, we find out that traditional large language models perform worse than humans, while reasoning models perform better in the exploratory task in open-ended world. And we also find out large language models mainly use uncertainty-driven but not empowerment-driven strategies, while humans can actually balance this. But surprisingly, reasoning models can use both strategies higher than humans. And we also show converging evidence from feature mapping, steering, and sort analysis that traditional large language models think too fast to explore effectively. This work cannot be done by Nanpan, the co-first author, and Bob Wilson. So there is a lot of people I want to thank. If you are interested in our work, so you can scan the QR code to fill the paper. Also, Nanpan is applying for a PhD, and also I'm actively seeking for a postdoc. So if you are interested in our work, so we're happy to connect. Thank you so much.
Okay, beautiful. So I'm interested in how compulsions form in OCD, and just as a brief note, while we usually think of compulsions in the context of OCD, they are also present, these repetitive behaviors, in other disorders like gambling and other addictions or hoarding, but specifically in OCD, compulsions are related to a second aspect, which is the idea of obsessions or intrusive negative thoughts that produce distress. And so the compulsions are linked to the desire to relieve this distress, maybe perhaps through control seeking. So the goal is to avoid manifesting these distressing outcomes related to the intrusive thought. So for instance, if you're obsessively worried about contamination, what you might end up doing is washing your hands every time you touch an object that somebody else may have touched, which will become a stereotyped repetitive behavior, and its goal is to avoid the outcome of contamination. So with this OCD-specific presentation of compulsions in mind, there are two leading accounts that might explain how compulsions form. One is failures to understand the structure of the environment, how are actions, states, and outcomes linked. And two is the habit hypothesis of impaired goal-directedness and control. So you understand the contingencies in the environment, but you can't act towards the goal. We previously suggested that there's a way to reconcile both of these through looking at not just how people can learn the structure of their observable immediate environment, but rather how they take into account dependencies and hierarchies between their local observable goals and tasks and the bigger future goals. For example, washing your hands makes them clean right now in the moment, but it also serves your longer-term goal of staying healthy, which spans a larger set of tasks, subtasks, and maybe other goals as well. And we found evidence of impaired ability in OCD to toggle this uncertainty reduction strategies in goal hierarchies. So in this project, I'm looking into why this might be happening. And specifically, I'm asking whether the impaired ability to integrate uncertainty across types and levels and goals might reflect, as has been suggested, a failure to produce a mental model. But the failure is not related to computing parameters for the underlying generative process, so you may still be able to learn links between actions, states, and outcomes. But perhaps it's related to misrepresenting the latent causal mechanisms that create those generative processes. So in other words, we're asking the question here whether OCD compulsions could reflect excessive structure seeking. So maybe you're so interested and invested in avoiding and controlling and predicting those distressing external outcomes that you're overrepresenting the amount and types of causal mechanisms that might be behind them. So to get at this, we used a perceptual categorization task that generated animal hybrids of varying perceptual uncertainty. So I'm showing you some that are low perceptual uncertainty, so 90% one animal, 10% another. They look mostly like what you would expect in this case a squirrel to look. Medium perceptual uncertainty, so they still kind of mostly look like the main animal, in this case the cat, but a little bit weird. And then high perceptual uncertainty, in which they are generated with 50-50 features from each of the two parent animals, and it's really hard to tell what they are. And so we included an irrelevant dimension in this task of conceptual uncertainty. In other words, some of these hybrids actually exist. For instance, horse-zebra, lion, tiger, these are things that actually exist in nature. Some of them don't exist, but are not that implausible, like perhaps a badger and the raccoon or a squirrel and the raccoon. And then some are entirely implausible, such as an ostrich and a giraffe. And the key here is you really just need to resolve the perceptual uncertainty to solve the task. So which features of the picture you're seeing are more like a cat or more like a gecko? But we were hoping that in order to do that, you still need to draw on conceptual knowledge, right? So what does a cat ear look like? What does a gecko look like? And so we thought this would likely prime people as they're solving this task to still take into account a little bit the idea of conceptual knowledge and conceptual uncertainty, but we did not actively tell them anything about whether the hybrids are plausible or not. So this second type of uncertainty is task irrelevant. It is not mentioned in the task at all. And then we saw how participants made this decision, how long it took them, how confident they were in their decision, how accurate they were in the cases in which there wasn't accuracy, so anything that wasn't 50-50. And we replicated a lot of previous findings around slower decisions, lower confidence in their decisions in the presence of higher uncertainty of all types. And so people who scored higher on a scale of obsessive-compulsive symptoms were slower, had less confidence in all uncertainty conditions. But the key finding here is we saw this in the high conceptual uncertainty conditions. So we saw that people who were high in their OCI scores were less confident and slower in the low perceptual uncertainty, high conceptual uncertainty conditions, which again, this is a task-irrelevant construct. They did not have to care about conceptual uncertainty at all. We fit a drift diffusion model in order to better understand the dynamics of these decisions and how they're being made. And we found, again, findings that are consistent with our behavioral data, specifically the threshold of the DDM, which usually codes for how much evidence do you need to make your decision, was higher in people who scored higher on the OCI scale. We also found differences between the low and high conceptual uncertainty. Again, low perceptual uncertainty, so the task should be easy to solve. This task-irrelevant uncertainty was high, and they found differences in drift rate, so how quickly they're accumulating the information, and threshold between those low and high irrelevant uncertainty conditions. All of this put together is suggesting to us that high OCI participants do actually pay attention to this task-irrelevant uncertainty when they shouldn't. So it is beginning to provide evidence to the idea that perhaps they're just misrepresenting how many things may be contributing to solving the task. They're excessively searching for structure that does not need to be searched for. We also have some gaze and pupil data that I will go over in the poster. And if anybody is looking for grad students, one of the students involved in this is graduating this year, and he is looking to join a lab with computational modeling of mental health. All right, thank you so much, and I hope to see you at the poster session.
everyone. So today I'm here today to talk to you about curiosity, individual differences in trait curiosity. So just, looking at trait curiosity as a sort of broadly stable, almost like a personality trait, and attention control. But first I want to start by talking about curiosity and attention generally. So obviously we've all been talking about how things like curiosity helps to drive the spotlight of our attention. It really helps to direct our information seeking, making it more likely that we're going to approach new, complex, ambiguous stimuli and see it as more of like a challenge than a threat. And in this way, we sort of see it as being a kind of a motivational counterweight, acting against something like a knowledge emotion like anxiety, which makes it less likely that we're going to approach difficult or complex information, and enjoyment, which makes us want to really stick with what we know. And it's been suggested that in this way, that curiosity can work as a sort of an approach avoidance regulatory function. What we see is this kind of showing this curiosity can have this adaptive role, and it can work really well with our attention and interact in really helpful ways. And that can be seen in the studies which show that people who are high in trait curiosity have these really beneficial outcomes with higher enhanced creativity, academic success, innovation, divergent thinking, and hyperfocus and flow. But interestingly, curiosity can also interact with attention in less helpful ways. And that could be seen in studies which have shown that people in higher in trait curiosity also have less helpful outcomes at times, with mind wandering, distractibility, social media addiction, and even conspiracy thinking. So what I was wanting to know is what's going on here? Why does curiosity seem to have this almost like double-edged sword, interacting with our attention in ways that can be incredibly beneficial, but other times perhaps less helpful? So really, what is driving these different outcomes? And perhaps it's that there are individual differences in these different types or different dimensions of curiosity, where maybe it's interest or deprivation type curiosity, or maybe it's the different dimensions in the 5 DCR model. But what I was really interested in is perhaps it's got something to do with the relationship between trait curiosity and attentional control. So why attentional control? Well, attention control is one of those building blocks of attention. It's the ability to control and direct our thoughts and actions to achieve our goals, particularly when dealing with conflicting or distracting information. So my question is really whether curiosity and attentional control might interact like levers in different people, so pushing them into different outcomes, but also perhaps they're interacting with each other in some way. But for us to answer this, we first need to understand what is actually the relationship between curiosity and attention control. Is there a relationship between curiosity and attention control? And what does the empirical data show us? Well, importantly, from neuroscience evidence, there is some suggestion that when looking at state curiosity and attention control, there is a sort of heavy overlap between brain regions associated with these two mechanisms. But there's a real gap in looking at studies that assess individual differences in trait curiosity and attention control, particularly using behavioural tasks rather than self-report for this attentional control construct. So that's the purpose of the study that I undertook earlier this year. And we conducted a large online study with a final sample of 385 participants who completed 3 different behavioural tasks assessing attention control. You might have heard of these before, the Flanker, Stroop, and Simon task. Well, these are particularly new versions of these particular tasks that are designed to reliably measure individual differences. And what we did is we had people complete these 3 tasks and then create an attentional control factor based on their performance across these tasks. We also had them complete measures of curiosity, focusing on that trait curiosity of 5 DCR. Because we're looking at individual differences, we wanted to get a full gambit of different dimensions of curiosity, personality, and also we looked at some epistemic motivations as well. So, is there a relationship between curiosity and attention control? Well, what we found is that trait curiosity does have a significant relationship with attention control, but that relationship varies in strength and direction depending on the dimension of curiosity. So as you can see here, there is a significant negative relationship with joyous exploration, deprivation, sensitivity, and thrill-seeking. So people who are higher in these dimensions of curiosity actually performed worse on the attention control tasks, whereas people who are higher in covert social curiosity performed better on the attention control tasks. Well, what's going on here? Well, perhaps we now have some evidence which shows that if you're higher in these types of dimensions of curiosity, you have this higher approach tendency. Perhaps you're more drawn in by conflicting information. Whereas whether you're higher in covert social curiosity, although you're highly curious, perhaps this is a more conflict-averse form of curiosity, and perhaps you're better at avoiding or conflicting, suppressing information suppressing conflicting information. So what this shows is that there is this relationship, but it's complex, it's nuanced, and when looking at individual differences. And I just wanted to note also is that when thinking about this, we should also think about personality. We have completed exploratory mediation analysis and found that personality also mediates this relationship between curiosity and attention and control. But again, the picture is different. So different types of personality factors have different pathways between curiosity and attention control. Depending on the personality factor, it can be positive or negative. And we're also looking at some latent profile analysis and found that different curiosity profiles of people are having predictive values, both in terms of epistemic motivations and attention and control. So why does this matter? Well, we now do have some empirical evidence that different dimensions of trait curiosity are associated with attention control, but this is a complex picture, and we should also be taking into account personality when thinking about these things. So this is hopefully going to help support and develop our theories, particularly the ones which do rely on this concept of the relationship between curiosity and attention control. And it's also going to kind of help provide useful evidence in understanding how individual differences in curiosity and attentional control might interact to produce those either beneficial or less helpful outcomes and shape how people explore, decide, and learn in the real world. Thank you.
I'm Jordan. I'm a postdoc at the University of Hamburg, and today I give you a little teaser of some work that we've been doing which combines EEG and eye tracking to explore how people make multi-attribute decisions. So, imagine that your phone has been broken, and you go to the shop to buy a new one, and the guy there starts bombarding you with information about this phone has this battery capacity, and this screen size, or this price. Right? And you somehow have to integrate all of this information in order to make a choice about which phone you're going to buy. And you're probably a bit overwhelmed, but we seem to do this quite efficiently. We seem to get by. And there's many other decisions which require this weighing up of multiple attributes. And here we combine EEG and eye tracking to explore both how people search for and integrate all of this information to make a choice. So, we recently proposed a model of how people do this. It's called the Multi-Attribute Search and Choice Model, or MASC, and it has a Bayesian hierarchical framework which assumes that people sample attribute values through fixating. They then update their belief about the value of an attribute before weighing up and integrating all of this information to create some kind of higher level value representations about options as a whole. And then people continue this process iteratively of fixating and updating until there is sufficient evidence to determine that one option is superior. Now, at the core of MASC is its myopic search rule, and this assumes that people search efficiently, but not necessarily optimally for information. So fixations are only planned one step ahead. And this is a very simple search rule, but the natural consequence of this is that attention is driven by value, importance, and uncertainty. So what you see here on the left is I give MASC the first 4 fixations, and I ask it to predict the location of the 5th. So you can see that when the first 4 fixations are exploratory and the attribute weights are equal, the model will predict that you're most likely to look at the higher value option next. However, if the attribute weights are unequal, so one attribute is weighted highly compared to the other, then the model predicts that you will look at the most important attribute to you. And if you skip something during your initial round, then the model predicts that you are very likely to look at the thing that you have not yet seen. And this is because value, importance, and uncertainty all give you the best opportunity to narrow your posterior belief distribution and end the decision in an efficient manner. So, the question we were interested in is, firstly, with this model, can we predict how people actually search for information? But more interestingly, in my opinion, is can we actually track this belief updating process in the brain in real time as people search for information? So, our participants did a multi-attribute choice task in which we presented them with 2 phones, each characterized by 3 attributes, while we recorded their EEG and their eye movements. And then, by fitting MASC to the eye tracking data, we were able to quantify how much belief updating occurred at each fixation. So simply by calculating the KL divergence between posterior's pre and post fixation, we had this measure of how much each fixation updated someone's belief, both at the level of attributes and at the level of options. And then we took these predictors and we put them through a linear deconvolution model. So we wanted to use these predictors to predict fixation-evoked activity. So e.g. activity time locked to fixations. So simply, yeah, attribute updates and option updates predicting brain activity. Now, you're probably thinking, well, in EEG, eye movements are usually treated as the devil, right? We don't want them. But with a little bit of pre-processing and this linear deconvolution, you can turn eye movements from villain to hero. They can tell you something interesting. So, for example, this deconvolution model not only allows us to include mask in our predictions, but it also accounts for overlap. So the overlap that is evoked by successive fixations, so the activity overlaps, we can correct for that. And it also allows us to account for other properties of eye movements that we may not be interested in, but still have an effect on the signal, and we want to control for them. So, because I want to stay within the 5 minutes, and I want you to come to my poster, I will skip my results. But as a spoiler, can we predict people's fixation patterns? Yes, we can. Mass does a very good job, and I can show you if you come to my poster. And yes, we can track this belief updating in the brain. So we found 2 distinct signals in the brain with differing topology and timing, which were both predicted by masks, attribute, and option level belief updating. So hopefully I see you later. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Alice. I'm a 5th-year grad student working with Oriel Feldman Hall here at Brown. And today I'm going to share with you some recently published work on how knowledge of social network structure shapes strategic gossiping. So in many social settings, like this conference that we're all attending, there may be many times when you're talking to a colleague or a friend and deciding to share or not share certain information. And in those moments, you are probably not only considering your direct conversation partner, but also the people that they might share this information with. As you map out someone's social network, or really just the web of relationships that surround them, the act of sharing information becomes more complex because each connection acts as a conduit for things like gossip to travel along. So even casual disclosures can ripple outward in unexpected ways, and this is a central challenge of social navigation. Here we ask what cognitive mechanisms support inferences about information flow in social networks, which are inherently dynamic and uncertain. And to address this question, we first built a small artificial network where we can control learning. The network members here vary in popularity or how many direct friends they have. But to capture how people reason about information flow in particular, we give participants a challenging strategic goal, which is to spread gossip widely in this network while avoiding the target of gossip. Now first, to learn this network, we don't show participants this nice bird's eye view of the network. What they do instead is that they see someone in the network outlined in blue here, for example, Olivia, then they click on each gray square to learn who Olivia's friends are. If someone is not a friend, then that square would turn red, and if someone is a friend, then they'd be outlined in green, face up, and this would continue until the participant has found all of this person's friends. And next, in the critical gossip sharing task, we tell participants that gossip has emerged about one of the network members, the target, shown at the top here. And then on each trial, participants, as if they were embedded in this network, would have to rate how likely they would be to share gossip with every other network member, it's like the receiver. Okay, so how do people achieve this goal? We find that even when a receiver only has one friend, participants are very sensitive to network distance, which is plotted on the x-axis here. So the farther the receiver is from the target, the more likely people share gossip with them. That's larger values on the y-axis. On the other hand, when it comes to the most popular receivers who have 4 friends, people are significantly less likely to gossip when they are direct friends of a given target. But when this target is farther away, they become more willing to gossip with these same receivers. And we see a continuous effect across intermediate levels of popularity. So this result really suggests to us that based on friendship information alone, people very quickly infer the structure of a social network and then flexibly apply this knowledge to achieve a very complex communication goal that they weren't ever explicitly prepared for. But the ultimate test of these, of how people use these structural properties is out in the wild. And to test this, we rely on a real-world social network comprising Brown undergrads. And here, as you can see, there are hundreds of connections that create countless paths for information to flow through, making social inference problems even more challenging. So we use a modified version of the previous task, such that a participant, like this one here in yellow, now learns that someone nearby, the source, has shared some personal news. And now participants have to judge how likely it is that someone else, the receiver, will hear about it. So because we're asking who's likely to hear news, you should expect the opposite pattern of results from the gossip sharing task, such that a friend of the source should be more likely to hear information. And that is indeed what we find. People do expect direct friends to be more likely to hear the news even from a source who isn't well connected. But as distance from the source increases, participants believe that information is less likely to reach these receivers. And when the source is more popular, closer receivers are even more likely to hear the news, and this drop-off with distance is less steep. So we find that despite the complexity of a real-world social network, distance and popularity still shape how people reason about information flow. Now, to understand the type of mental representation that supports these kinds of inferences, we tested two models. First is the successor representation, which reflects the step-by-step movement through a network. So information can travel probabilistically from one node to another, kind of like in a chain here. But this misses a key property of information, which is that it can propagate simultaneously along multiple paths. And the CATS communicability model does capture this property, and it relies on the accumulation of influence across many possible paths. So through formal model comparison, we find that CATS wins, and it importantly recapitulates the patterns that we find in our observed data. So the key takeaway here is that the ability to predict how information spreads from a single person relies on a mental representation of the structural properties of a social network, which can be captured by a computational model of multi-step connectivity. I'd like to thank my advisors and co-authors, other collaborators on this project, my lab, and all of you for listening. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about a project on delayed credit assignment that I actually did while here at Brown. So in order to refine your future behavior, it's essential to learn which past actions you took led to a certain outcome or state, a process called credit assignment. For instance, if you're not feeling great today, is that because you didn't have breakfast, you just read an upsetting text, maybe you didn't sleep enough this week, or perhaps you drank a little too much at the hot club last night? While figuring out which of these actions led to your negative state is critical for avoiding it in the future, this is actually a very difficult problem for us to solve, given the complexity of our environment, and that some actions will affect you more immediately, like these, while others might not have a noticeable effect until later. This difficulty led to an interest in understanding whether and how people learn to differentially assign credit to the immediate and long-term consequences of actions. To do so, we developed a novel task where on each trial, participants encountered different activities performed by an avatar, let's call him Bill, and subsequently had to predict Bill's overall pain after experiencing that activity on a cumulative pain scale. And they're then given feedback of Bill's actual pain level. We then tested their learned preferences for these activities in a separate task by having them select between two previously seen activities for Bill to engage in where their goal was to minimize his overall pain. We incorporate short versus long-term consequences in this task by randomly assigning the 4 activities in each block to one of 4 possible effects, where they'd either decrease or increase pain and would do so in the short or long term. Importantly, the activities' effects are not something that's given to participants, but they have to infer over the course of trials. The key difference here between short and long-term effects is their transiency and timing. For example, let's say Bill engages in an activity that decreases his pain in the short term. His pain will immediately decrease on that trial. However, since short-term effects are transient, Bill's pain reverts to what it was prior to engaging in the activity, and its effect does not impact any future trials. Thus, short-term effects are transient and immediate. In contrast, if Bill engages in a long-term activity, we would see his pain not be affected on the current trial. Instead, Bill's pain decreases on the next trial. Furthermore, since long-term effects are not transient and thus persist through time, the mean by which pain is calculated on future trials gets shifted. So long-term effects are delayed and persistent. So we implemented this generative process in the prediction task I showed you before, but importantly had 3 possible conditions where participants would either experience an activity only once, twice, or 4 times before a new activity was selected. So to determine what was driving participants' pain predictions in this task, we ran a linear regression that assessed the influence of different factors on participants' prediction updates. So participants did indeed seem to be learning, given that a major predictor was their previous prediction error, but of greater interest to us was how much participants updated their predictions in response to the short and long-term consequences of activities. In our 1 rep condition, participants were responsive to the activity's short-term effects, but weren't able to accurately account for the effects of long-term activities whatsoever. But we saw as we sequentially repeated activities that participants became increasingly capable of updating their predictions in response to long-term activities. Additionally, we saw an opposite pattern for short-term consequence learning, where participants became less responsive to short-term activities with more repetitions, suggesting that there may be somewhat of a trade-off between short and long-term consequence learning. This was also reflected in our assessment task, where again, the goal for participants was to minimize pain. Here, 1 rep participants correctly preferred the activity that decreased pain in the short term over the one that would increase it, but did not show this preference for long-term activities. However, in higher repetition conditions, participants did generally retain their understanding of short-term effects, with a slight preference for activities that increase pain in the short term, but importantly, also gained a preference for activities that decrease pain in the long term over those that increased it. Ultimately, though, when we engage in activities in the real world, we're not just passively observing them, we're selecting what activities we want to engage in. So we decided to run a follow-up study where participants could select Bill's activities during the prediction task and really exploit the structure of the task to enhance their learning of short and long-term consequences. And this agency naturally led to a lot of variation in how participants were sampling activities, where the effect of repetition sort of basically replicated what we saw in study 1. And you could come to my poster to see those full results. But what we were really interested in here was whether individual differences in activity selection patterns in this prediction task actually translated to individuals' learned activity preferences in the assessment task. So to do so, we quantified how often participants consecutively repeated activities in the prediction task with repeat frequency, where a low value means greater activity switching, while a high value indicates further repetition. We then correlated this metric with how often individuals selected the activity that would decrease pain in the assessment task, and looked at this separately for short and long-term activities. So for long-term activities, we saw that greater repeating of activities significantly correlated with a better understanding of long-term impacts on pain, while greater activity switching led to a worse understanding. For short-term activities, we saw a slight correlation in the opposite direction, where greater switching led to a better understanding of short-term effects, further suggesting a trade-off between short versus long-term consequence learning dependent on how individuals structure activities in time. Overall, this suggests that not only do individuals highly vary in how they explore and sequence their actions, but that these sequencing differences lead to major differences in what they learn, where perseveration, which is often regarded as a dumb or faulty choice policy, might actually be a useful form of structured exploration that sort of allows participants to get a handle on long-term consequences. Yeah, so thanks to Matt and Rike for all their advice, and yeah, come by my poster, check out the preprint.